Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, this little channel only exists because people like you decide, quietly, it's worth a small gesture. If you subscribe, it simply starts finding its way back to you. No searching required the next time you can't sleep. A like helps too. It costs nothing and tells me these stories are worth making more of. While you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe a house in Texas, everything gone quiet for the night. Somewhere in Ohio, the day finally winding down. A flat in Manchester, with the rain against the window. Leave a comment and tell me. I always read every single one. All right, love. Dim the lights. Let your body go heavy. Comfortable? Good. Let's go. The castle is not yet awake, not properly, though it is no longer fully asleep either. There is a particular hour, somewhere between the last watch of the night and the first grey suggestion of dawn, when a great stone fortress makes a sound unlike any other sound it makes across the rest of the day. Not silence. Something quieter than silence, if that makes sense. The wind finds every arrow slit and every chimney flue and turns each one into a low, breathy note, so that the whole building seems to be exhaling. Somewhere below, in the kitchens built half underground for the sake of the ovens, a fire that never fully goes out is being coaxed back to life, and the first smell of the day is not bread. Not yet, but simply smoke, damp stone, and tallow. This is Elswick Castle. That is not its real name, not the name history remembers it by, because tonight I want you to picture something composite, something built from a dozen real fortresses so that no single detail has to carry the weight of being exactly, provably true. But everything inside it is drawn from the real record. The people who live here are the king, whose name is Aldric, the queen, whose name is Isolde, and their 3 children. The eldest, a boy of 11 named Godfrey, who is already being shaped into a king before anyone has quite explained to him what that means. A girl of 8 named Rosalind, who has opinions about everything and shares most of them. And a boy of 4 named Tobias, who at this hour is still fast asleep, one small fist curled against his cheek, entirely unaware that his whole life has already been arranged around a future he cannot yet imagine. Queen Isolde is awake first. This alone would surprise most people, because the popular image of a medieval queen is someone roused by attendants, drawn slowly up out of sleep like a photograph developing, women moving around her before she has even opened her eyes. Sometimes that is true, tonight it is not. Isolde has been awake for nearly 20 minutes already, lying still under a coverlet stuffed with wool and lined with squirrel fur, listening to the castle change its breathing, because she has never, not once in 15 years of marriage, managed to sleep past this particular hour. There is a stillness in her before the day begins that she's come to treasure without ever quite admitting it to anyone, not even to Aldric, who sleeps beside her still, one arm thrown across the space where she used to be. Here is something that tends to surprise people. In many medieval royal households, the king and queen did not routinely share a bed, or even a bedchamber on a nightly basis. Separate chambers were common, sometimes adjoining, sometimes not, and a shared night was often circumstantial rather than expected. Tonight, in this castle, Aldric and Isolde happen to share one, and there is nothing remarkable in that to either of them. It is simply where the night found them. I mention it only because it quietly undoes an assumption a lot of us carry into stories like this one, without noticing we are carrying it. Isolde slips out from under the coverlet without waking him. The stone floor is cold enough to sting through the rush matting, and she finds, by memory rather than sight, the wool slippers left exactly where she left them the night before, because habit is one of the only forms of control a person has in a life this heavily arranged by other people. The chamber itself is smaller than you might imagine. Grand, yes, hung with tapestries meant to trap heat against the stone as much as to impress anyone, but the actual sleeping space, the intimate square footage of it, is modest. Warmth was the real luxury in a medieval castle, more than square footage, more even than gold. A small room holds heat, a great hall does not. She crosses to the narrow window, more a slit than a window by our standards, and looks out at a sky just beginning to lighten along one edge, the colour of a bruise healing, greenish-grey giving way to something faintly rose. Below, the outer bailey is already stirring. She can hear it more than see it. A dog. A bucket set down too hard on stone, someone coughing in the particular way people cough when they have been awake in cold air for an hour already, and their body has not forgiven them for it. And here is the detail I actually want to sit with for a moment, because it is the kind of thing that gets left out of most versions of this story, and it should not be. Isolde is 34 years old, and she has, by any measure available to her time, an extraordinary life. She wears silk that travelled from further away than most of her subjects will travel in their lifetimes. She commands a household of dozens. She will never carry water, never grind grain, never worry, not truly, about whether there will be food on the table come winter. And she is, this particular morning, quietly frightened about something she has told no one, not her husband, not her closest lady, not even, in any word she's allowed herself to think clearly, herself. We will come back to this. I promise we will. But I wanted you to know it was there, sitting under everything else, the way a stone sits under a garden bed, invisible until something makes you dig. Let us step outside her chamber for a moment, because the castle does not wait for any one person, and there is a great deal happening in these same minutes that is worth your attention. Down in the kitchens, which sit in a separate building entirely, connected to the main hall by a covered walkway, 3 men are already at work, and here is a fact that tends to catch people off guard. Kitchens were frequently built apart from the main castle structure, not attached to it, precisely because of fire. A blaze in the kitchen, which happened often enough to plan around, could then be contained without threatening the hall, the chambers, the chapel, everything that mattered more. It is a small architectural decision that tells you something large about how these people thought. Not paranoid exactly, just realistic about what fire does to wood and thatch and stone that has not yet learned, the way later stone would, how to resist heat. The head cook, a broad, quiet man named Aldric, who has held this post for 11 years, is already elbow-deep in dough that was started the night before and left to rise slowly near the bank coals. Bread in a castle of this size was not a single loaf baked once. It was an operation, ongoing, constant, feeding not just the royal family but the entire household, which on an ordinary day might number somewhere between 80 and 120 people, depending on who was visiting, who was training, who had brought retainers along for the season. That number tends to surprise people too. We picture a king and queen, and perhaps some servants. The reality was closer to a small town living inside one set of walls. Knights in training, clerks, falconers, grooms, laundresses, a chaplain, and often 2 or 3 junior priests beneath him. Musicians on retainer, not merely called in for feasts. All of them needed to be fed, twice a day at minimum, and all of that bread had to rise on a schedule that did not care whether anyone had slept well. Back upstairs, Isolde's lady-in-waiting, a woman named Beatrix who has served her since before Godfrey was born and has become something closer to a friend than a servant, though neither of them would ever say the word aloud, has slipped into the chamber with a candle and the particular quiet efficiency of someone who has done this exact task on this exact morning 1,000 times before. She does not wake the king. She simply begins laying out what the queen will need, and there is a kind of choreography to it that neither woman has to think about anymore. I want to pause here on something small and specific, because I think it is the kind of detail that makes a place feel real rather than staged. The gown Beatrix lays across the wooden chest at the foot of the bed is a deep, soft blue, dyed with woad, and it has been worn perhaps 12 times already this season, because contrary to what a lot of period films suggest, even queens rotated a relatively modest wardrobe by our standards, caring for garments carefully, mending them, having them altered rather than simply replaced. Clothing at this level of society was extraordinarily expensive to produce, not because of the labour alone, but because of the dye, the weave, the years sometimes required to source a particular shade of blue or a particular weight of wool. A queen's gown was closer to an heirloom than to something disposable. There is a soft knock at the door, and it is Rosalind, 8 years old, already dressed, or mostly dressed, her hair still loose and uncombed, standing in the doorway with the specific expression of a child who's been told to stay in bed and has decided on her own authority that the instruction did not apply this particular morning. Isolde does not scold her. She simply holds out a hand. and Rosalind crosses the cold floor in bare feet, wincing dramatically the whole way, and climbs into the space Aldric has just vacated, because he has finally stirred and risen and gone, without a word, toward the small adjoining chamber where he keeps his own things. Godfrey, at 11, sleeps in a different part of the castle entirely, and this is worth explaining, because it surprises people every time. Royal sons, particularly heirs, were very often moved out of the family's private chambers at a young age, sometimes as young as 7, to begin a more formal education among other boys, tutors, and increasingly the company of older knights, whose habits he was meant to absorb by proximity as much as by instruction. Godfrey has his own small chamber now, shared with 2 other boys of similar rank, sons of allied families sent here specifically so that Godfrey would grow up with companions rather than only servants and tutors. He has been awake for a while already, and not happily. There is a lesson this morning he has been dreading, and we will get to that too. For now, though, let us stay a moment longer with Isolde and Rosalind, curled together in the last warm minutes before the day fully claims them, because there is something in it worth noticing. A queen, in the version of history most of us absorbed without meaning to, is often flattened into symbol, crown, marriage, political alliance made flesh. And all of that is true in its way. But she is also, in this exact moment, a mother whose daughter has cold feet and wants to be near her, and there is nothing in any treaty or any coronation oath that touches that particular fact. It exists alongside everything else, ordinary and enormous at the same time. Let us follow Aldric now through the low door into his own dressing chamber, because his morning looks nothing like hers, and the difference tells you something about how differently the 2 halves of a royal marriage actually functioned. He is 41, a decade older than his wife, built like a man who has spent most of his life in some form of physical training. And even now, with his crown still an hour away and his hair unbrushed, he carries himself the way men do when they have never once in their adult lives had to wonder whether a room would make space for them. His body servant, a young man named Wystan, has laid out a linen undershirt, a woolen tunic in a deep wine red, hose, and over it all a surcoat bearing the family's device, a hawk in flight over 3 waves, which Isolde privately finds slightly overwrought but has never said so, not in 15 years. Dressing a king was, in the strictest sense, a political act as much as a practical one. Certain garments were reserved for certain days, certain visitors, certain seasons of the church calendar, and getting it wrong was not merely embarrassing. It could be read as a slight, an insult, even an omen, depending on who was watching and what mood the court happened to be in that week. Here is a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people, and I find myself smiling every time I think about it. Kings of this era bathed more often than the popular imagination gives them credit for. Not daily, not by our standards, but full baths, in large wooden tubs lined with linen cloth to prevent splinters, were not the rare, dreaded event that centuries of jokes have made them out to be. Aldric bathed perhaps twice a week in the warmer months, less in winter when heating enough water was its own considerable labour, but the water itself was often scented, sometimes with rosemary, sometimes with mint gathered from the kitchen garden, because even a king wanted to smell like something other than wool and horse. Wystan works quickly and mostly in silence. The 2 of them settled into a rhythm built from years of repetition, and it is only as Aldric is fastening his own belt, waving off help with the particular impatience of a man who dislikes being fussed over, before he is properly woken up, that a messenger arrives at the outer door of the chamber, slightly out of breath, having clearly taken the tower stairs faster than was strictly wise. There is news from the border, nothing alarming, a minor dispute over grazing land between 2 lesser lords whose names Aldric has to be reminded of more often than he would like to admit. But it means his morning has just acquired a shape it did not have 5 minutes ago. This is worth sitting with for a moment. We tend to imagine kingship as something grand and constant, crowns and thrones and pronouncements. The actual daily texture of it, more often than not, was closer to this. Small disputes, land boundaries, 2 men who cannot agree on where one pasture ends and another begins, and a king who must somehow find time, between breaking his fast and attending mass, to care about it anyway. because if he does not, someone smaller than him will have to, and that has its own risks. He tells the messenger he will hear the full report after chapel, and the young man withdraws, and for a moment, alone, Aldric simply stands there, one hand still on his belt, looking at nothing in particular. There is a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep, and I think most of us know it, whether or not we have ever worn a crown. Down the corridor now, in the boys' chamber, Godfrey is having a considerably worse morning. His two companions, sons of a neighbouring house sent here to be raised alongside him, are already dressed and clearly enjoying, in the quiet way boys enjoy things at that age, that Godfrey has not yet mastered something the tutor demanded of him the day before. It is Latin, specifically, a passage he was meant to have committed to memory, and he has not properly, and there is a very real chance the morning's lesson is going to go badly. I want to pause on this, because the education given to a medieval royal heir was considerably more demanding than most people assume. It was not simply swordplay and horsemanship, though there was plenty of both. Godfrey studies Latin daily, along with basic arithmetic, some rudimentary law, the histories of his own family, and several allied ones, stretching back generations, court etiquette down to the smallest gesture, and increasingly, as he approaches 12, the beginnings of formal weapons training that will intensify considerably over the coming years. A future king who could not read a treaty, who could not follow the Latin of a church service, who did not understand the precise weight of an insult delivered in the wrong tone at the wrong moment, was a liability to his own house, and everyone around Godfrey understood this, even if Godfrey himself at 11 mostly understood it as a great deal of homework he did not want to do. His tutor, an aging cleric named Brother Alfric, who has taught 2 generations of this family's children and has grown neither more patient nor less fond of any of them across the years, arrives precisely on time, and the lesson begins in the small study that was once, before Godfrey's grandfather's day, simply a storeroom for grain. Godfrey stumbles through the passage. Brother Alfric corrects him, not unkindly, but not gently either, and somewhere in the middle of it, Godfrey catches himself wondering, the way children do, whether any of this actually matters, whether Latin verbs will help him against an enemy in the field, and he does not yet have the vocabulary, ironic given the subject, to explain to himself why the answer is yes. Meanwhile, down in the great hall, the trestle tables are being set for the household's first meal, and this too tends to surprise people once they hear the details. Breakfast, in the sense we mean it now, a dedicated first meal eaten shortly after waking, was not universally standard across the medieval period. In many households, the first proper meal of the day came later, closer to what we would call mid-morning, sometimes preceded only by a small piece of bread and watered wine, to break an overnight fast that had quite literally given the word its meaning. In this castle, on this particular morning, the household eats lightly and early, bread, a soft cheese, small beer, which was considerably weaker than what the word beer suggests to modern ears, brewed specifically to be safer than the water, and drunk by everyone, including children, without anyone thinking twice about it. Isolde and Rosalind come down together, Rosalind's hair now properly braided, courtesy of Beatrix's quick hands, and they take their places near the head of the hall, though not, interestingly, in the exact centre. That position is reserved, and this is a detail I genuinely love, for the salt cellar, a large and often elaborately worked piece of silver or gilt that marked, quite literally, the social geography of the entire meal. To sit above the salt meant you a family, favoured guest, someone of real standing. To sit below it meant you were part of the household but not its inner circle. It sounds almost too neat to be true, a metaphor made furniture, but it was a real and widely understood system, and everyone in that hall, down to the youngest kitchen boy, who would never sit anywhere near that hall at all, knew exactly what it meant. Aldric joins them a few minutes later, the messenger's news still sitting somewhere behind his eyes, though he does not let it show, and the family eats together in a way that is both entirely ordinary and, when you sit with it, quietly remarkable. Tobias, 4 years old, is finally awake now, brought down by his own nurse, and he climbs immediately into his father's lap without asking, the way small children do when they have not yet learned that a king's lap is not supposed to be treated as public furniture. Aldric does not correct him. He simply shifts to make room, breaking off a piece of bread and handing it down without looking, an automatic gesture built from years of exactly this. The bell for morning mass sounds not long after, a single deep note from the chapel tower, and the entire household begins to move toward it in a way that feels, even now, faintly like a tide changing direction. The chapel itself sits within the castle walls, a small cool stone building separate from the main hall, and it is here, I think, that something about medieval royal life becomes genuinely difficult for a modern mind to fully absorb. Faith was not, for a family like this, a private matter tucked into Sunday mornings. It was daily, structural, woven into the very rhythm of the hours, in a way that had almost nothing optional about it. Mass is said by the household's own resident priest, a soft-spoken man named Father Cuthbert, and the family attends, along with a good portion of the household, every single morning without exception, rain or shine, war or peace. Godfrey stands beside his father, Rosalind beside her mother, Tobias fidgeting quietly against Isolde's skirts, and for these 20 minutes or so, something in the whole household seems to settle, the way a room settles when everyone in it has for once stopped needing anything from each other. I find this detail genuinely moving, more than I expected to when I first read into it. For all the ceremony and hierarchy that structured nearly every other hour of a day like this one, Mass was one of the few moments where a king, a queen, a scullery boy, and a laundress stood, at least in theory, on the same ground before the same altar. The theology of the era insisted on it. The practice, more often than not, actually reflected it, at least for these particular minutes. After Mass, the day properly begins to fragment, each member of the family peeling off toward their own obligations, and it is here that I want to slow down and follow Isolde specifically for a while, because her mourning holds something I promised we would return to. She retreats, not to her private chamber, but to a smaller room just off the great hall, that has, over the years, become something like her office, though no one in this century would use that word for it. It is here that she receives the steward, a careful, precise man named Ranulph, who has managed the castle's household accounts for nearly 2 decades, and together they go over what needs to be gone over: grain stores, the wages owed to the laundresses, paid partly in coin and partly in cloth, as was common, a dispute between 2 of the kitchen staff that has apparently been simmering for a week and needs, in Isolde's private assessment, to be resolved before it curdles into something worse. This is worth sitting with, because it runs against a fairly persistent assumption people carry about medieval queens, the idea that their role was largely decorative, a matter of appearing beautifully dressed at feasts and producing heirs. The reality in households like this one was considerably more demanding. A queen very often ran the actual daily machinery of a castle's domestic life, its accounts, its staff, its stores, freeing the king to focus on matters of land, law, and war. Isolde manages, in effect, a small and complicated economy every single day, and she does it with a precision that Ranulph, who has served 3 different noble households across his career, has told her more than once he has rarely seen matched. It is in the middle of this, going over a ledger with Ranulph, that the thing she has been carrying since before dawn finally surfaces briefly in a way she cannot quite suppress. Ranulph mentions in passing, almost as an aside, that her own mother's health has apparently worsened, word having arrived 2 days prior through a travelling merchant with connections to that household, and Isolde's hand goes still over the ledger for just a moment too long. Here is what she has not told anyone. Her mother lives 3 days' ride from this castle, in a smaller holding that has been, for as long as Isolde can remember, a place she associates less with comfort than with a particular kind of watchful coldness, the sort a daughter learns to read early and never quite unlearns. And yet the thought of that woman failing, growing smaller, perhaps dying without Isolde present, has settled into her chest over these past days, like a stone she cannot put down and cannot quite explain, not even to herself, because the 2 of them were never, in any way most people would recognize, close. Isolde does not weep. Queens of this era, and this one in particular, were not raised with much permission for that sort of thing, not in front of a steward, not in the middle of a working morning. She simply nods, thanks Ranulph for the information, and asks him to continue with the grain figures, and if her voice is very slightly different for the next several minutes, He is either too discreet or too focused on his own numbers to remark on it. This is the paradox I mentioned earlier, the one sitting quietly under everything else in this story. Isolde has by any external measure more security than almost anyone in this kingdom. Walls thick enough to stop an army, servants enough to anticipate her every need before she voices it, a husband who, whatever else might be said of their arranged and politically convenient marriage, has never once raised a hand to her and has over the years come to genuinely respect her judgment. And still, this particular morning, she is quietly, privately frightened, in a way none of that security touches at all, about a relationship that was never safe to begin with, and a woman she is not entirely sure she has ever forgiven and might now never get the chance to. I do not think this needs a moral attached to it. I think it simply sits there, true, the way most real things about people sit there, slightly unresolved, and we can carry it with us as we move on to the rest of the morning, because the castle, of course, does not pause for any one person's private grief, however quiet. Out beyond the great hall, past the covered walkway that connects it to the kitchens, there is a garden, walled on all four sides, and I want to spend some time here, because it is the kind of space that rarely gets the attention it deserves in stories about castles. We tend to picture medieval fortresses as grim, grey, entirely functional places, all defence and no softness. The reality for a household of this wealth included considerable beauty, deliberately cultivated. The garden is not large, perhaps 40 paces across, but it is dense with purpose. Herbs for the kitchen and for medicine grow along one wall. Rosemary and sage and feverfew, tended by an elderly woman named Mildred, who has held this exact role for so long that no one, including Isolde, can quite remember a time before her. Along another wall, roses, planted more for beauty and scent than for any practical use, a genuine luxury in a world where most cultivated land had to justify its existence through yield. Rosalind loves this garden with the specific fierce devotion that children sometimes attach to small private kingdoms, and she is there now, having slipped away from her own morning lessons for a few stolen minutes, crouched beside Mildred, asking questions the old woman answers with far more patience than she shows almost anyone else in the household. What is this one for? Does it hurt if you eat it? Why does this one smell different when you crush it? Mildred answers each question fully, as though an 8-year-old girl's curiosity about feverfew were the most reasonable thing in the world, and in a sense, within these walls it is. Here is a fact I find genuinely delightful, and I suspect you will too. Gardens like this one served a function we would now call medicinal, and the line between what we might call cooking and what we might call medicine was, in this era, far blurrier than it is today. A headache might be treated with a tisane of feverfew, a stomach complaint with mint or fennel. Mildred's knowledge, built entirely from oral tradition passed down across generations of women in roles like hers, was in many respects the closest thing this household had to a resident physician for minor ailments, and her expertise was taken seriously, consulted before, not instead of, anything more formal. Rosalind is called back to her lessons before too long, dragged reluctantly away by a young attendant sent specifically to retrieve her, and the garden settles back into its quieter rhythm, Mildred humming something tuneless to herself as she works, the bees, newly active in the warming morning, moving between the rosebuds with the kind of unhurried purpose that makes a person watching them forget, for a moment, that anything in the world could possibly be urgent. Meanwhile, back inside, word has reached the hall that a visitor is expected before midday, a lesser lord named Wilfred, arriving with a modest retinue to discuss, ostensibly, a matter of trade routes through the eastern part of Aldric's territory, though everyone with any real understanding of court life suspects the actual purpose has more to do with positioning his eldest daughter as a potential match for Godfrey in some years' time. Godfrey, mercifully, has not yet been told this part. The arrival of any visitor, even a minor one, set off a specific and fairly elaborate chain of preparations in a household like this, and it is worth walking through, because the choreography of hospitality in this period was its own quiet art form. Word had come ahead, 2 days prior, giving Isolde and her steward time to plan a proper welcome, which meant, at minimum, ensuring the guest chambers were aired and freshly strewn with clean rushes and dried lavender, that additional provisions were set aside for a larger midday meal than usual, and that the household's best linens, kept for precisely these occasions, were retrieved from careful storage. There is a detail here that tends to genuinely surprise people, and I want to give it a moment. Hospitality, in this era, was not merely a matter of manners. It carried something closer to sacred weight, a set of obligations that both host and guest understood as binding in ways that went beyond simple politeness. To fail to properly welcome a guest, even a minor and somewhat tedious one like Wilfred, could be read as a genuine insult, a statement about how his house was regarded, with consequences that might ripple outward for years. Isolde understands this completely, and so, whatever else is occupying her thoughts this particular morning, the preparations for Wilfred's arrival receive her full and careful attention. Aldric, for his part, spends the remainder of the late morning in a smaller council chamber, hearing the fuller report on the border dispute the messenger brought at dawn, along with two lesser matters that have been waiting for his attention, a request from a local abbey for timber rights, and a complaint, delivered with considerable formality by a merchant who has travelled some distance to deliver it in person, about a toll being charged unfairly at a bridge crossing that falls under Aldric's jurisdiction. None of these matters are dramatic, none of them will make it into any chronicle written about this reign, and all of them require his judgment, his time, his willingness to sit and listen to men explain, at some length, why they are right and the other party is wrong. I think this is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it corrects something the popular imagination tends to get wrong about kingship in this era. We picture grand gestures, battles, coronations, the sweeping arc of history, the actual daily labour of ruling, for a king like Aldric, in a kingdom of this modest but genuine size, looked far more like this. Small disputes, tedious hearings, a steady stream of people who needed a decision made and had in the end nowhere else to take it. By the time the midday bell rings, calling the household to its main meal, Wilfred and his small retinue have arrived, dusty from the road, and the great hall has transformed itself into something considerably grander than the quiet breakfast scene from earlier in the day. Trestle tables, plain boards on trestle frames by design, so they could be dismantled and cleared after each meal, freeing the hall for other uses, have been arranged in their formal midday configuration, the high table set on a low dais at one end, running perpendicular to the lower tables, where the household proper takes its place according to that same quiet geography of the salt cellar. Isolde has seen to it personally that Wilfred is seated well above the salt, close to Aldric, a small and deliberate signal of respect that costs nothing and means a great deal. The meal itself is more substantial than the morning's bread and cheese, though still, by the standards of an evening feast, relatively restrained. There is a pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew that form the backbone of most medieval meals across every level of society, though the version served here is considerably richer than what a peasant household would recognize. Thickened with barley and enriched with fat skimmed from roasted meat, there is roasted fowl, there is fresh bread, there is watered wine for the adults and small beer for the children, and there is, near the centre of the table, a dish that Wilfred eyes with poorly disguised interest, a small pie filled with dried fruit and spices that had travelled, in some cases, thousands of miles to reach this particular table. Here is a fact worth pausing on, because it says something real about what wealth actually meant in this world. Spices, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, ginger were not simply flavouring in a household like this. They were a visible, edible demonstration of reach and resource, evidence that this family's connections extended far beyond the borders anyone at this table could see. A guest like Wilfred, tasting that pie, was meant to understand something about the family hosting him, and he did, and said so, with the kind of elaborate compliment that court etiquette both encouraged and, frankly, expected. Conversation across the meal moves between the formal and the surprisingly casual, trade routes and toll disputes giving way, at points, to something closer to gossip. News of a wedding 2 territories over, a rumour about a bishop's ill health, a joke Aldric makes at his own expense that draws real laughter from further down the table than protocol would strictly require. Rosalind, seated near her mother, watches Wilfred's daughter, a girl perhaps a year or two older than herself, who has accompanied her father on this visit with the frank, assessing curiosity children bring to any new arrival, and by the meal's end, the two of them have struck up the particular fast intimacy that sometimes happens between children who have decided, wordlessly, that they like each other. Godfrey, seated closer to his father than usual given the presence of a guest, conducts himself with a formality that Isolde notices and privately approves of, though she says nothing, because 11-year-old boys do not generally respond well to being praised for good behavior in front of guests. He asks Wilfred a question about the eastern trade route under discussion, a question that reveals he has actually been paying attention to something during his lessons after all, and Aldric, catching his wife's eye across the table for just a moment, allows himself something close to a proud smile. After the meal, the afternoon settles into a slower, more varied rhythm, and I want to move through several different threads of it with you now, because there is a great deal happening across this castle in these hours, and each thread reveals something a little different about the texture of this family's life. Aldric takes Wilfred, along with a small party that includes 2 of his own senior knights, out to the mews where the castle's falcons are kept, because falconry served, in this era, a function that went well beyond simple sport. It was a shared language among the nobility, a way of spending an afternoon together that allowed for exactly the kind of unhurried, informal conversation that formal council chambers did not permit. Watching a bird fly is a strange, absorbing thing to do together, and quarrels have a way of softening in the middle of it. The falconer, a wiry, weathered man named Cerdic, who has spent more of his life around birds than around people, brings out Aldric's favoured hawk, a peregrine named, with a lack of imagination Aldric himself finds amusing, simply grey. Here is a detail I genuinely love. Trained falcons of this quality represented an investment of years, not merely money, the training itself a slow, patient process that could not be rushed or purchased outright, only built, session by session, between bird and handler. Grey had been with this household for 6 years, and Cerdic could read her moods, her readiness, her reluctance, with a precision that Aldric himself, for all his authority over nearly everything else in this castle, simply deferred to entirely. The flight itself, when it comes, is a small, sharp thing of beauty, Grey rising fast and steep into a sky that has by this hour cleared to a pale and generous blue, and for a few minutes, watching her, none of the men standing in that field are thinking about toll disputes or trade routes or the quiet, ongoing calculations of alliance and marriage that structure so much of their lives. They are simply watching a bird do the thing a bird does best, and there is something almost meditative in it, a shared silence among men who spend most of their days talking. Back inside the castle walls, Isolde has taken Wilfred's daughter, along with Rosalind, into a smaller solar, a private sitting room warmed by its own hearth and considerably more comfortable in the way of soft furnishings and good light than the great hall could ever manage. Here, needlework is underway, and I want to spend a little time on this too, because embroidery in this period was a far more serious undertaking than the word tends to suggest to modern ears. Isolde is working on a piece that has occupied her, on and off, for nearly 8 months. A large hanging destined eventually for the chapel, depicting in careful and painstaking stitches a scene from scripture rendered in silk thread, dyed in colours that took considerable skill and expense to produce. This was not idle hobby work. Embroidery of this quality represented genuine skill, cultivated over years, and pieces like this one could take a year or more to complete, worked on in whatever spare hours a woman of Isolde's rank could gather across weeks and months of an otherwise fully scheduled life. Rosalind, meanwhile, is working on something considerably simpler, a small piece meant for practice more than display, and her stitches are uneven in the specific way of a child still learning, but her mother does not correct her too harshly, remembering, perhaps, her own early attempts at the same skill under the far less patient eye of her own mother, a thought that arrives and then quickly is set aside again, because this is not the moment to sit with that particular ache. Let me pause the story itself for a moment, though we will stay inside this same afternoon and talk more directly about clothing, fabric and jewellery, because Isolde's needlework has put me in mind of it, And it is one of those subjects where the actual historical detail is so much richer than the general impression most of us carry around. The wool that makes up the bulk of everyday clothing in this castle, for everyone from the scullery boys to the king himself, was not a single uniform material. It varied enormously in weight, weave and quality, and a trained eye, which every single person in this hall possessed, whether they thought of it that way or not, could read social rank at a glance simply from the fineness of a garment's weave and the depth and evenness of its dye. A coarse, loosely woven wool dyed unevenly in cheap plant dyes marked a servant. A tightly woven, densely dyed wool, especially in colours that were difficult or expensive to achieve, marked wealth, and marked it instantly, before a single word was exchanged. Blue, the shade Isolde favours, required woad, a plant that had to be processed through a genuinely unpleasant fermentation process to yield its colour, labour-intensive enough that a deep, even blue represented real expense. Red, which Aldric favours for formal occasions, came from madder root for more affordable shades, or, for the richest and most saturated reds, from an insect called kermes, imported at considerable cost, which produced a colour so associated with wealth and status that certain shades of red were, in some times and places, restricted by law to those of sufficiently high rank. Purple, rarer still, tied historically to Tyrian dye extracted, almost unbelievably, from the glands of a particular sea snail, was so costly to produce that it remained, across much of medieval Europe, functionally restricted to royalty and the very highest nobility, not always by explicit law, but simply because almost no one else could afford it. Silk, which is old wares for the most formal occasions, arrived in this castle having travelled an almost unimaginable distance, along trade routes that stretched, link by link, merchant by merchant, back toward regions she will never see and can barely picture with any real accuracy. A single length of silk represented the combined labour and risk of dozens of people across thousands of miles, and wearing it was, in its own quiet way, a kind of story a person told about themselves without saying a word. Jewellery followed similar logic. Isolde's rings, several of them, are set with stones whose value lay as much in their rarity and the skill required to cut and set them as in the raw material itself. A brooch she wears often, a gift from Aldric early in their marriage, features a garnet cut and polished by a craftsman whose entire trade, passed down through a family workshop across generations, revolved around exactly this kind of precise, painstaking work. Jewellery of this quality was not merely decoration, it was portable wealth, easily carried, easily concealed if circumstances required it, and more than one noble family across this era had, in moments of genuine crisis, quietly liquidated jewellery to fund an army or survive a siege in ways that land, however valuable, simply could not provide. I find myself genuinely admiring the sheer density of skilled labour represented in a single afternoon's worth of clothing and jewellery in a household like this one. Dyers, weavers, tailors, goldsmiths, gem cutters, each contributing a piece of expertise refined across years, sometimes generations, all of it converging on the specific gown Isolde is wearing this particular Tuesday, an ordinary day by the standards of her own life, though nothing about the labour behind her clothing was ordinary at all. The afternoon light, by now, has begun its long, slow slide toward evening, and the household's rhythm shifts again, this time toward the preparations for the evening meal, which tonight, given Wilfred's presence, will be somewhat grander than an ordinary supper, though still well short of the full formal banquet reserved for major feast days and celebrations. In the kitchens, Osric and his small staff have been working for hours already, because a meal of this scale required a lead time that modern cooking, with its instant heat and refrigerated storage, simply does not demand. A larger joint of meat, in this case a haunch of venison brought in 2 days prior by Aldric's own huntsman, requires slow roasting over several hours, turned by hand on a spit by a boy whose entire afternoon task is precisely this, turning meat over and over, close enough to the fire that his face has taken on a permanent flush by mid-afternoon. There is a fact here I think is worth sharing, because it complicates a fairly common assumption about medieval food. The popular image tends toward heavy, undifferentiated meat and bread, with little regard for balance or freshness. The reality, at least at this level of society, was considerably more sophisticated. Osric works with a wide range of vegetables from the castle's own gardens: onions, leeks, cabbage, root vegetables stored carefully through winter, along with herbs that shape flavour with real intention rather than simply masking spoilage, a myth about medieval spice use that has proven remarkably persistent despite having little real evidence behind it. Meat that had genuinely spoiled was not eaten, spice or no spice. The households wealthy enough to afford imported spices in any quantity were, almost without exception, also wealthy enough to afford meat that did not need masking in the first place. As the light continues to fade, candles and rushlights are being prepared throughout the hall, and this too deserves a moment, because lighting a space this large after dark was its own significant undertaking. Beeswax candles, cleaner burning and far more pleasant smelling, were reserved for the family and honoured guests, while tallow candles, rendered from animal fat, cheaper but considerably smokier and less pleasant, lit the lower tables and the servants' spaces. The difference in smell alone, beeswax's faint honeyed sweetness against tallow's heavier, greasier note, marked social space as clearly as any other signal in this world, an entire hierarchy a person could read with nothing but their nose. By the time the evening meal begins, the great hall has transformed once more, this time into something warmer and more golden than either of its earlier configurations that day. The trestle tables have been reset, the high table now dressed with the household's better linen, and musicians, 3 of them tonight, a man on a small harp, another on a pipe, a third simply singing, have taken up a quiet position near one wall, filling the space beneath the general hum of conversation with something soft and unhurried. Aldric and Isolde take their places at the centre of the high table, Wilfred seated to Aldric's right, his daughter beside Isolde, and the children arranged according to an order that has been worked out, through long practice, to keep Tobias close enough to his nurse that a sudden 4-year-old crisis can be managed without disrupting the wider table. Godfrey sits near enough to the adults to be included in their conversation when it turns to him, far enough that no one expects him to carry it. The meal itself unfolds across a series of courses, though course, in this context, meant something closer to a wave of dishes brought out together rather than the single plate, single dish sequence familiar to modern dining. The venison arrives first, carved at the table with real ceremony by a servant whose entire role, on formal occasions, revolved around this exact skill, precise cuts, correct portions distributed according to rank, a small but genuinely demanding art in its own right. Alongside it comes a dish of stewed pears in wine, a pottage thickened with almonds, imported and expensive, and bread of a finer, whiter grade than the household's everyday loaves, made from wheat that had been more carefully sifted to remove the coarser bran. Here is a detail I think is genuinely worth sitting with. The whiteness of bread, in this era, functioned almost exactly like the deep saturated colours in clothing we talked about earlier, a visible, edible marker of status. Whiter bread required more processing, more waste in the sifting, and was correspondingly more expensive, so a household's ability to serve consistently white bread to its guests said something about its wealth before a single other dish reached the table. Conversation across the meal ranges widely, and it is here, in these relaxed evening hours, that some of the castle's real business quietly gets done in ways that would never appear in any formal record. Wilfred, 3 cups of wine into the evening and considerably more forthcoming than he had been across the afternoon's council discussions, mentions, almost in passing, a piece of information about a neighbouring lord's finances that Aldric files away with the particular stillness of a man who has just been handed something useful without having had to ask for it. This is how a great deal of medieval diplomacy actually functioned, not through formal negotiation alone, but through exactly this kind of loose, wine-warmed conversation across a shared table, where guards came down just enough to let something real slip through. Isolde, meanwhile, has drawn Wilfred's daughter into an easy conversation about the girl's own household, her mother's health, a wedding that is apparently being planned for an older cousin, and beneath the pleasant surface of it, both women understand, without either saying so directly, that this conversation is also, in its way, an assessment, each quietly gathering information about the other's family that might matter a great deal in the years to come, When Godfrey is old enough for the marriage question Wilfred's visit most likely, if unofficially, concerns. As the meal winds toward its close, the musicians shift into something livelier, and there is dancing, of a kind, though not the elaborate formal dance most period dramas depict. It is simpler than that, a circle dance that draws in not just the high table, but a good portion of the lower hall as well, servants and household knights included, because certain occasions, certain hours of a certain evening allowed for a temporary and genuinely felt loosening of the rigid hierarchy that governed the rest of the day. Rosalind and Wilfred's daughter dance together, laughing at their own mistakes, and even Godfrey, coaxed reluctantly by his mother, joins for one round before retreating, red-faced, to the safety of standing beside his father again. Aldric watches all of it with the particular contentment of a man whose day, despite a border dispute and a tedious toll complaint and the quiet, ongoing labour of governing, has arrived at this. Firelight, music, his children laughing, his wife, 3 tables away in the physical sense but close enough, still, in every way that actually matters. He catches her eye once more across the noise of the hall, and something passes between them that neither Wilfred nor anyone else at that table is positioned to see or understand. 15 years of shared, complicated, genuinely fond history compressed into a single, unremarkable glance. I want to tell you something about medieval marriage here, briefly, because it tends to get simplified into something colder than it usually was. Aldric and Isolde's marriage was, without question, arranged, negotiated by their respective families when both were considerably younger, built around land and alliance rather than any early romantic choice of their own. And yet marriages built this way did not preclude real affection, real partnership, sometimes even real love, developing across years of genuinely shared life. It was common, not universal but genuinely common, for exactly this kind of quiet, unglamorous devotion to grow in the space a political arrangement had cleared for it, and watching them tonight, it is difficult not to believe that is precisely what happened here. As the evening deepens further, Wilfred, well-fed and well-wined, begins the long, slow process of taking his leave for the night, escorted with appropriate ceremony to the guest chamber that has been prepared for him, and the household, gradually, begins its own long unwinding towards sleep. Tobias is the first to be taken up to bed, carried more than lead at this point, his small body heavy with the particular boneless exhaustion of a 4-year-old who has fought sleep as long as his eyes would allow him to. His nurse, a warm, broad woman named Isolde, who has raised more children in this household than her own memory can easily account for, settles him into a small bed set close to her own, in a chamber adjoining the family's private rooms, and hums something low and tuneless as she works, not so different in its way from the sound Mildred had made over the herb beds that same morning, though neither woman would ever think to compare the two. Rosalind goes up not long after, still faintly giddy from the dancing, full of questions about Wilfred's daughter that she fires at Beatrix in a steady, breathless stream as she is undressed and readied for sleep. Beatrix answers what she can, deflects what she cannot, and by the time Rosalind's head finds her pillow, the questions have slowed to something closer to a mumble, and then to nothing at all. Godfrey, at 11, no longer requires this kind of tending, and there is something in that fact that Isolde, checking in on him briefly before he settles for the night, finds herself quietly mourning even as she is proud of it, the particular ache of watching a child become, gradually, someone who needs you less. He is lying on his own narrow bed, a single candle burning low beside him, a book of Latin grammar open on his chest, though his eyes have clearly stopped tracking the words some minutes ago. She sits on the edge of the bed for a moment, the way she used to when he was smaller, and asks him, quietly, how the day's lesson went, and he tells her, with the particular candour children sometimes offer only at the very end of a long day, that he is worried he will never be as good at this as his father expects him to be. Isolde does not offer easy reassurance. She tells him, instead, that his father struggled with exactly this same lesson at exactly his age, a small true thing she happens to know, because Aldric has told her so himself, more than once, usually with real self-deprecating humour attached to it, and watches something in her son's shoulders loosen, just slightly, at the news that the distance between himself and his father's expectations is perhaps not as vast as it had felt an hour before. I want to hold on to this moment for a beat longer than the story strictly requires, because I think it says something true about parenthood that outlasts any particular century. A king's son, heir to a title that will shape the rest of his life whether he wants it to or not. And still, underneath all of that, simply a boy worried he is not good enough, comforted by his mother in exactly the plain, unglamorous way any child anywhere might be comforted. Crowns change a great deal. They do not change this. Once the children are settled, Isolde makes her way back down toward the great hall, where the last of the evening's activity is finally winding down, servants clearing the tables, the musicians packing away their instruments with the unhurried care of men who will be doing this again tomorrow and the day after that, and most days for years to come. Aldric finds her near the hearth, and for a while, before either of them retires, they simply stand there together, not talking especially much, watching the fire settle into its last active hour before someone will bank the coals for the night. This might be a good moment to talk a little more broadly about the seasonal rhythm of a household like this one, because a single day, however richly detailed, cannot capture the way the calendar itself shaped royal life across the whole of a year. Christmas, or the Feast of the Nativity as it would more commonly have been called, represented the single largest celebration of the entire year in a household of this rank, a period of festivity that could stretch across nearly 12 full days, filled with feasting, gift-giving, elaborate entertainments, and a formal court gathering that drew nobles from considerable distances, all of it demanding preparation that began, in practical terms, weeks in advance. Easter carried its own weight, following the long austerity of Lent, a period during which even a household as wealthy as this one observed real dietary restriction, meat set aside in favor of fish and simpler fare, a discipline that applied, at least in principle, to the king and queen exactly as it applied to the lowest servant in the castle. One of the few moments across the calendar where the usual hierarchy of the table briefly, formally leveled itself. Midsummer brought its own traditions, bonfires and gathering, older customs that predated the church calendar entirely and had simply been absorbed into it over centuries, layered rather than replaced. Harvest in late summer and early autumn brought a different kind of feast, one tied directly to the visible, tangible success or failure of the year's crops, a celebration with genuine stakes behind its festivity in a way that could feel almost solemn beneath the surface merriment. And scattered throughout the year, tournaments, when circumstances and finances allowed, elaborate, expensive, genuinely dangerous events that drew knights from allied households eager to demonstrate skill and win favor, occasions Aldric approached with a complicated mixture of genuine enthusiasm and quiet, private anxiety, because for all the ceremony and rule governing these contests, men were sometimes seriously injured, occasionally killed, and a king watching from the stands could not always fully separate the sport from the risk sitting plainly underneath it. There is another tradition worth mentioning here, one that tends to genuinely surprise people when they hear it for the first time, concerning the giving and receiving of gifts at the New Year, rather than at Christmas itself, a custom widespread across much of medieval Europe. Isolde still remembers, with real fondness, a gift Aldric gave her their second year of marriage, a small illuminated book of hours, its pages painted by hand with scenes so finely detailed that she had, at the time, genuinely struggled to believe human hands had produced them without some manner of trick or aid. She keeps it still, in a small chest near her bed, and reads from it most mornings, a private habit almost no one else in the household knows about. Books, generally, were another marker of extraordinary wealth in this world, in a way that is easy for us to forget entirely, living as we do surrounded by more text than any single medieval household, however wealthy, could ever have hoped to accumulate. A single illuminated manuscript could take a scribe and an illustrator working together the better part of a year to produce, the pigments themselves sourced from materials as exotic and costly as the dyes we discussed earlier, gold leaf applied by hand, one careful stroke at a time. Isolde's small book of hours, unremarkable by the standards of a great cathedral library, would nonetheless have represented a genuine fortune to almost anyone outside these walls, and she treats it, still, with a care that reflects exactly that understanding. Let us step back inside the present moment now. back to Aldric and Isolde standing together by the dying fire in the great hall, because the night is not quite finished with them yet, and there is something small and lovely still to come. Aldric mentions, almost offhand, that Wilfred lets slip something useful over the wine, the piece of information about the neighbouring lord's finances, and Isolde, without missing a beat, tells him she had already gathered as much, and more besides, from the daughter over their own quieter conversation. Aldric laughs, genuinely, the specific laugh he reserves for moments when his wife's competence catches him freshly off guard, even after 15 years of watching her demonstrate it, and says something to the effect that he sometimes wonders which one of them is actually better suited to running this kingdom. It is not entirely a joke. Both of them understand this, standing there in the firelight, and neither feels any particular need to resolve the ambiguity out loud. They make their way up together, finally, toward the private chamber where the day began, and Isolde pauses briefly at the narrow window she had stood before that morning, looking out now at a sky gone fully dark, stars visible in the particular dense, uninterrupted way they are visible only in places without the competing glow of other light, which in this era of course meant everywhere. She thinks once more of her mother, 3 days' ride away, and this time allows herself, finally, a few private minutes of something close to grief, standing quietly at the window while Aldric, sensing without being told that this is not a moment for conversation, busies himself elsewhere in the room, giving her exactly the space she needs without either of them having to name what is happening. I think there is something worth noticing in that too. 15 years of a marriage that began as a political arrangement had built, somewhere along the way, this kind of fluency, a language made almost entirely of small gestures and careful silences, each of them reading the other with an accuracy that no amount of formal courtly training could have taught either of them. It simply had to be built, slowly, across years, the way most real intimacy actually gets built, whatever century you happen to live in. When she finally turns from the window, whatever grief had briefly surfaced folded back down into its usual quiet place, they retire together, and the candle beside their bed is, before too long, extinguished, leaving the chamber lit only by the faint banked glow of the hearth's last coals. The castle itself does not fully sleep, of course. It never does, not entirely. Somewhere along the outer wall, a watchman makes his slow, familiar circuit, boots scraping softly against stone worn smooth by generations of exactly this same nightly walk. In the kitchens, the fire that was coaxed back to life before dawn this same morning has been banked down again, low and careful, ready to be built back up in a few short hours when the whole cycle begins again. In the stables, a groom checks the horses one final time before finding his own bed in the loft above them, straw rustling faintly under his weight, and somewhere in this vast ancient structure, in a chamber not so different from the one Aldric and Isolde now occupy, Godfrey has finally fallen fully asleep. His Latin grammar slipped from his chest onto the floor beside the bed, his candle burnt down to almost nothing. Rosalind sleeps curled on her side, one hand still faintly smelling of crushed rosemary from her morning in the garden. Tobias sleeps against Hilde's steady, familiar warmth, utterly unaware, as only the very young can be, of everything that has happened around him across this single long layered day. Let me take you somewhere slightly different now, still within the walls of this same castle, but forward a little in the year, to a different night entirely, because there are aspects of this family's life that a single ordinary Tuesday, however full, could never fully capture. It is deep winter now, several months on from the day we have just spent together, and the castle wears winter very differently than it wears the milder seasons. The walls that felt merely cool in autumn now hold a bone-deep chill that no amount of hung wool or hearth fire fully banishes, and the household has adjusted its whole rhythm accordingly, activity clustering close to whatever fire can be found, the great hall itself feeling smaller somehow, more intimate, as everyone instinctively gathers nearer the heat. This is the season of the great Christmas court, and preparations for it have occupied the household for the better part of 3 weeks already. Extra provisions have been laid in, additional guest chambers aired and readied, and the great hall itself has been transformed, greenery brought in from the surrounding woods to dress the walls, holly and ivy and boughs of fir, filling the air with a sharp resinous smell that layers itself over the usual smoke and tallow, in a way that Rosalind, now a little older, has come to associate entirely with this particular time of year. Here is something I find genuinely fascinating about medieval Christmas celebrations, a detail that tends to catch people off guard. The feasting itself often ran considerably longer than a single day, stretching across what was known as the 12 days, from the Nativity itself through to the Feast of the Epiphany, with different days carrying different customs and different levels of formality. It was not one great feast, but a whole sequence of them, building and easing in intensity across nearly 2 full weeks, an endurance test of hospitality that a household of this size had been managing, in one form or another, for generations before Aldric and Isolde ever inherited the responsibility. Nobles have travelled from considerably further afield than Wilfred's modest visit earlier in the year, some arriving with retinues large enough to nearly double the castle's usual population for the duration of their stay, and the logistics of housing, feeding and entertaining all of them fall, as they always do, primarily on Isolde's careful management, working alongside Ranulf and a small army of temporarily expanded kitchen and household staff, brought in specifically for the season. There is a specific tradition worth pausing on here, the appointment, in some households of this era, of what was sometimes called a Lord of Misrule, a figure often chosen from among the household's lower ranks, given temporary license to preside over certain revels with a kind of comic, inverted authority, ordering knights and nobles about in playful defiance of the usual hierarchy for the duration of a single evening's entertainment. This particular household observes a milder version of the custom, and this year the honour has fallen, much to his own visible delight, to a young stable hand named Aldwin, who spends one entire evening directing an increasingly absurd series of games and forfeits that has even Aldric, laughing harder than Godfrey has seen him laugh in months, submitting to instructions from a boy who mucks out his horse's stall every single other day of the year. I think there is something worth noticing in a custom like this, beyond its simple entertainment value. A society this rigidly hierarchical, in nearly every other respect, built deliberate, sanctioned space for exactly this kind of temporary inversion, a pressure valve of sorts, allowing everyone involved to feel, briefly and safely, what it might be like for the usual order to bend. It never actually threatened that order. If anything, its being permitted, contained, and then simply ended when the season concluded probably reinforced it. But for one evening, watching Aldric take direction from a stable boy with genuine good humour, the whole household got to laugh together at something that, on any other night of the year, would have been unthinkable. Godfrey, 12 now, having had his birthday somewhere in the months between the story we started with and this one, has been given, this Christmas, his first proper sword, not a training blade but something closer to the genuine article, sized appropriately for his age and strength, and the gift carries a weight that goes well beyond the object itself. It is, everyone in that hall understands without needing it explained, a quiet public marker that his childhood is beginning to give way to something else, and Aldric's face, watching his son turn the weapon over in his hands with careful, serious attention, holds an expression that is difficult to fully name, pride and something sadder both present at once. Rosalind, now 9, has been given a small illuminated psalter of her own, not nearly so fine as her mother's Book of Hours, but genuinely beautiful nonetheless, and she spends a good portion of the following days curled near whatever fire she can find, turning its pages with the particular careful reverence children reserve for objects they understand, even without being told, to be valuable. Tobias, 5 now, mostly cares about the sweets that have appeared in unusual abundance across the season, spiced and sugared treats that represented, in this era, a genuine luxury reserved almost entirely for exactly this kind of major celebration, and he spends a good portion of the 12 days in a state of barely contained sugar-fueled joy that Hild, watching over him with the patient exhaustion of a woman who has seen a great many Christmases exactly like this one, finds more endearing than exasperating most of the time. I want to take a little time now to talk about something we have only touched on so far, the experience of childbirth and early infancy within a household like this one, because it shaped so much of royal family life in ways that rarely make it into the popular imagination, and because it connects, in a way I think is worth sitting with, back to Isolde's own quiet fears from earlier in our story. Isolde was 17 when Godfrey was born, young by our standards, though not unusually so for her time and rank, and childbirth, for a woman in her position, was an event that carried genuine and widely understood danger, regardless of wealth or status. Physicians and midwives of considerable skill attended a royal birth, more resource brought to bear than almost any other household in the kingdom could summon, and still the risk remained real, present, acknowledged openly by everyone involved, in a way that a modern audience, accustomed to childbirth being comparatively safe, sometimes finds difficult to fully absorb. There is a custom worth mentioning here, the tradition of a lying-in period following birth, during which a new mother, even one as high-ranking as a queen, was expected to remain largely confined to her chamber for a period that could stretch to a full month or more, attended closely, resting, recovering, before a formal ceremony called churching marked her return to public and religious life. Isolde remembers this period, after each of her 3 children, as a strange, suspended time, equal parts genuine physical recovery and a kind of enforced stillness that she, a woman naturally inclined toward activity and management of her household's daily business, found harder to bear than the birth itself in some respects. The infants themselves, once born, were frequently placed, at least for a period, in the care of a wet nurse, a practice common across the nobility of this era, chosen from among healthy local women, sometimes drawn from the household's own staff, sometimes brought in specifically for the role. This detail surprises people fairly often, the idea that a queen might not personally nurse her own children, but it reflected the practical realities and expectations of her position rather than any lack of maternal feeling, and Isolde, for her part, remained closely and personally involved in her children's early care regardless, visiting the nursery daily, a habit not every noblewoman of her rank maintained, with quite the same consistency. Infant mortality, I should say honestly, remained a real and present concern across every level of medieval society, royal households included, though I want to be careful here because the actual historical picture is more complicated and less uniformly bleak than a lot of popular summaries suggest, and tonight is not the night to dwell in that particular darkness regardless. What I will say is that Isolde, like every mother of her era, understood the fragility of early childhood in a way that shaped, quietly, the fierce and careful attention she still pays each of her 3 living children, a gratitude that runs underneath her daily life like a current she rarely names directly but never entirely forgets either. Let me shift now to something warmer and stay there for a good while, because I think we have earned it, both of us, this deep into the night. Let us return to the library, that small stone room built once as a grain store and now devoted entirely to Godfrey's education, because there is more worth knowing about what actually filled a royal heir's days as he grew from the 11-year-old boy we met at the start of this story into someone gradually being shaped for the responsibilities waiting ahead of him. By 13, Godfrey's education has expanded considerably beyond Latin grammar and basic arithmetic. He studies now the specific legal customs of his father's territory, the complicated layered inheritance laws that will one day govern his own succession, along with the histories, sometimes genuinely tangled and contradictory, of the allied and rival houses whose relationships to his own family he will need to handle with real precision once the responsibility of rule falls to him. He has begun, too, more serious weapons training, not merely the wooden practice swords of his younger years, but real blades, blunted for training, but genuinely weighted, under the instruction of one of his father's most trusted knights, a hard, quiet man named Sir Aldric, who does not flatter his student, and has, on more than one occasion, left Godfrey bruised and considerably humbled by the end of a session. There is a fact here worth pausing on, because it complicates the image of medieval royal education as something narrowly martial. Godfrey studies music as well, expected to have at least a working competence on at least one instrument, in his case a small harp, not so different from the one played most evenings in the Great Hall, because musical skill was considered, at this level of society, a genuine mark of proper breeding, evidence of a mind capable of more than simple force. He has begun, too, to accompany his father on hunting expeditions with real regularity, not merely as an observer now, but as an active participant, learning the elaborate codified etiquette that governed a formal hunt, who rode where, who was permitted to make the final kill on a given quarry, how the animal was properly dressed and distributed afterward according to rank, an entire choreography as precise and meaningful, in its own context, as anything performed in the great hall during a formal feast. Let me walk you through one particular hunting day, because I think it captures something about this family's life that pure description alone cannot quite manage. It is early autumn, the year Godfrey turns 13, the woods beyond the castle walls turning toward the particular gold and rust that this part of the country wears for only a few brief weeks before winter strips it bare again. The party sets out before full light, Aldric at its head, Godfrey riding close beside him now rather than trailing behind with the younger attendants as he once did, Sir Baldric and 2 other knights completing the core group, along with a handful of huntsmen and a pack of hounds whose excited, barely contained energy fills the cold morning air with sound, long before the party has even cleared the outer bailey. The quarry today is a stag, spotted several days prior by one of the huntsmen scouting the woods on the castle's eastern edge, and there is a specific, careful process to a hunt like this one that far exceeds simple pursuit. Scouts had gone ahead the previous day to confirm the animal's rough territory. Relays of hounds and fresh horses had been positioned at intervals along the likely route, because a hunt of this scale could stretch across hours and considerable distance, far beyond what a single horse or a single set of hounds could sustain at full pursuit. This was not casual sport. It was closer, in its planning and execution, to a small military exercise, and Godfrey, watching his father coordinate the day's strategy with Sir Baldric and the head huntsman before they had even mounted, understood, with a clarity that struck him freshly that particular morning, that everything he was being taught, in every part of his education, eventually connected back to exactly this kind of careful, layered planning. The chase itself, when it finally comes, after nearly 2 hours of tracking and repositioning, is fast, loud, and genuinely thrilling. Hounds baying, horses moving at a pace that leaves no real room for thought, only reaction, and Godfrey, riding harder than he perhaps should for his age and experience, feels something in his chest that he will not have the vocabulary to properly describe for years yet, a kind of fierce, uncomplicated aliveness that has nothing to do with Latin grammar or inheritance law, and everything to do with cold air and speed, and the particular sound his own heart makes when it is working this hard. The kill itself, when it comes, is quick, and Aldric allows his son the honour of it, a small but significant gesture that Sir Baldric marks with a nod Godfrey will remember for a long time afterward. What follows is a process almost as codified as the hunt itself, the animal dressed on the spot according to precise custom, certain portions set aside by tradition for the hounds, others reserved specifically for the huntsman whose skill had made the day's success possible, the finest cuts destined for the castle's own kitchens and, eventually, for a table that will include, that particular evening, a proud recounting of the day's chase that loses nothing in the telling and gains, if anything, a little in Godfrey's own quietly embellished version of events. I want to shift now towards something gentler, because a night this deep should not stay too long in the excitement of a hunt, however thrilling. Let us talk instead about music, and about the particular kind of quiet that settles over a castle like this one on an ordinary evening, when no feast, no visitor, no special occasion calls for anything grand at all. The household employs, permanently, a small handful of musicians, distinct from the travelling minstrels who occasionally pass through and perform for a night or two before moving on to the next great household along their circuit. The resident harpist, a thoughtful, soft-spoken man named Aldric, who has held his post for nearly a decade, plays most evenings in the great hall, not always for any audience beyond whoever happens to be present, simply because music in this household was understood as something closer to a daily necessity than an occasional luxury. Isolde, in particular, has always found real comfort in Edric's playing, and on quieter evenings she will sometimes ask him to play something specific, an old, slow melody that she remembers, faintly from her own childhood, though she can no longer entirely recall where she first heard it or who taught it to her. Aldric plays it for her now, on request, perhaps once every few weeks, and there is something in the way she listens, eyes half closed, one hand resting loosely against the arm of her chair, that suggests the melody carries her somewhere private, somewhere none of the rest of the household, however close to her, is invited to follow. I find this detail genuinely touching. The idea that even a woman whose every public hour is so carefully structured, so relentlessly observed and accounted for, still keeps this one small private door, a piece of music that belongs to no one but her, unlocked by nothing but a request to a harpist who has learned over the years not to ask what it means to her, only to play it. Let me tell you about the castle itself now, its actual stones and structure, because we have spent a great deal of time inside its rooms and rather less time considering the building as a whole, and I think it deserves that attention, the way any character in a story deserves to be properly introduced eventually. Aldric Castle sits on a low rise of land, chosen generations ago by Aldric's ancestors for reasons that were entirely practical rather than aesthetic, a position that offered clear sightlines across the surrounding countryside in every direction, along with a natural slope that made any approaching force's task considerably harder than flat ground would have allowed. The outer wall, thick enough in places that two men could walk abreast along its parapet, has been added to and strengthened across several generations, different sections built in slightly different styles as successive lords addressed weaknesses exposed by advances in siege technology or simply by the slow, ordinary wear of decades of weather. Here is something worth knowing, because it corrects a fairly persistent myth. Castles like this one were not static structures built once and left unchanged. They were, in a very real sense, continuously under construction, upgraded, repaired, and expanded across generations as needs, threats, and available resources shifted. Aldric himself has overseen the addition of a new tower along the castle's northern wall, completed only 3 years prior, a project that occupied a significant portion of the household's resources and required, at its peak, the labour of stonemasons brought in from considerably further afield than the castle's own permanent staff could provide. The Great Hall, where so much of our story is already unfolded, sits at the heart of the inner structure, its roof supported by massive timber beams that required entire mature trees, carefully selected and seasoned, to produce, and its walls, we discussed earlier, hung with tapestries that served a genuinely practical function alongside their obvious decorative one, trapping heat against the stone in a building that would otherwise have felt, even in summer, considerably colder than most modern visitors would find comfortable. Beyond the Great Hall, the private chambers, the chapel, the kitchens in their separate fireproofed building, there is also, tucked into a quieter corner of the inner ward, a small scriptorium, little more than a single room really, where 2 resident clerks spend their days copying and maintaining the household's various records, correspondence, and the occasional devotional text commissioned for the family's own use. It was here, in fact, that Isolde's small book of hours had first been discussed, years ago, before Aldric ultimately commissioned its actual production from a workshop in a larger town some distance away, better equipped for work of that particular delicacy than the castle's own more modest scriptorium could manage. I want to mention too something about the castle's defences that tends to surprise people, because it runs against the popular image of constant medieval warfare. Ellswick, in the whole of Aldric's reign so far, has never actually been besieged, has never needed to test the full strength of its walls against a genuine hostile force. This was in fact fairly typical for a castle of this kind across long stretches of the medieval period. The defensive architecture existed as much for deterrence, for the simple visible fact of strength that discouraged conflict before it began, as for actual use, and Aldric, walking the walls occasionally with Sir Baldric, discussing this section's mortar or that tower's sightlines, understands this perfectly well. A wall that never needs to be tested has, in its own quiet way, done exactly the job it was built for. The moat, such as it is, more a wide, shallow ditch than the deep, dramatic water feature popular imagination tends to picture, serves a similarly practical rather than purely defensive purpose, managing drainage from the surrounding land as much as slowing any hypothetical attacker, and Rosalind, years earlier, had spent one entire memorable summer convinced there were fish in it worth catching, an ambition that yielded, across several weeks of determined effort, exactly nothing, though she remembers the trying more fondly than the failing. Let me bring you back now, gently, to something a little more human-scaled, because architecture, however interesting, can only hold a listener's attention for so long before the mind wants people again, wants faces, wants the particular warmth of a specific room, rather than the abstract sweep of stone and strategy. There was a stretch, One particular winter, when Rosalind, then 7, fell seriously ill, a fever that climbed higher across 3 consecutive nights than anything Hild or Mildred's careful remedies seemed able to touch, and I want to tell you about it now, not because it ends badly, it does not, but because it reveals something about medicine and care within a household like this one that pure description of herbs and gardens cannot quite capture on its own. The castle's approach to illness operated on several layers at once, and this tends to surprise people who expect a single, simple, uniformly primitive medical practice across the whole of the medieval period. Mildred's herbal knowledge formed the first and most immediate layer, tisanes and poultices drawn from generations of accumulated household tradition, applied quickly and without much ceremony for anything that seemed, at first, like an ordinary childhood complaint. When Rosalind's fever failed to break after the first night, though, a physician was sent for, a trained man from the nearest sizable town, arriving by the following afternoon with a bag of instruments and remedies considerably more formal and considerably more expensive than anything available within the castle's own walls. His methods, by modern standards, would strike most of us as a strange and uneven mixture of genuine insight and approaches we now understand to be ineffective or worse. He examined Rosalind's pulse with real care and attention, asked detailed, thoughtful questions about her recent diet and habits that reflected a genuinely observant clinical mind, and also, in keeping with the medical theory of his era, recommended a treatment involving the careful balancing of what were then understood as the body's 4 essential humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, a framework that shaped medical thinking across the whole of Europe for centuries and that we now know does not accurately describe how the body actually functions, though the physician applying it that particular week believed in it as completely and practiced it as carefully as any doctor today believes in the frameworks we currently trust. Isolde sat with her daughter through all 3 nights, sleeping in fits and starts in a chair drawn close to the bed, cool cloths and quiet, murmured reassurance her own contribution to a process that felt, to her in those exhausted hours, entirely out of her control despite every resource her rank and wealth could summon. Aldric, too, appeared at the doorway more than once across those nights, unable to do much of anything practical but unwilling, apparently, to simply retreat to his own chamber and wait for news, standing instead in the doorway for long stretches, watching his wife tend their daughter with an expression that Isolde, glancing up at him once during the second night, found she could not fully read, though she understood, without needing the specifics, exactly what was underneath it. The fever broke, finally, on the morning of the 4th day, and Rosalind's recovery from that point was steady and complete, though Isolde, for months afterward, found herself checking her daughter's forehead with her palm at odd moments, an anxious habit built in those 3 long nights that took a considerable while to fully fade. I mention this whole episode not because it is dramatic, though it genuinely felt that way at the time, but because it complicates, usefully I think, the easy assumption that wealth and rank made a medieval royal family somehow immune to the ordinary universal terror of a sick child. It did not. It simply meant they faced that terror with better resources, more attentive care, and, when the fever finally broke, precisely the same flood of relief any parent in any century would recognize instantly. Let me turn now toward something that unfolds more slowly, across years rather than days, because it belongs, I think, in this story too. Godfrey's formal path toward knighthood, which began, in the informal sense, the moment Sir Baldric first placed a blunted training sword in his hands, moves, across his teenage years, through a series of increasingly demanding stages that most modern audiences know only vaguely, if at all. By 14, Godfrey has become what would have been recognized, in the formal terminology of the period, as a squire, attached directly to Sir Baldric's household within the castle, responsible for tending his mentor's armour and weapons, accompanying him on various duties, and absorbing, through close daily proximity, the practical and social knowledge that no amount of formal instruction alone could fully convey. This apprenticeship model, learning a role by living alongside someone who already held it, shaped an enormous amount of medieval education, well beyond the specific case of knighthood, and Godfrey's days, across these years, blend physical training, practical service, and a kind of ongoing informal mentorship that Sir Baldric, gruff as he remains, clearly takes seriously, correcting Godfrey's form during practice with the same exacting care he brings to every other aspect of his own considerable skill. The knighting itself, when it finally comes, arrives the spring Godfrey turns 18, and it is by any measure one of the most significant single days this household will experience across the whole span of our story, and I want to walk through it slowly, because the ceremony itself carried layers of meaning that a brief mention could never properly convey. The night before, following custom that stretched back generations before Aldric's own father ever held this title, Godfrey kept what was known as a vigil, spending the hours from dusk until dawn alone in the castle's chapel, his sword laid across the altar before him, in prayer and quiet reflection meant to mark the seriousness of the commitment he was about to formally undertake. He had fasted for much of the preceding day as well, and by the time Father Cuthbert came to fetch him as the first grey light reached the chapel's narrow windows, Godfrey was exhausted in a way that felt, he would later tell his mother, entirely appropriate to the occasion, a tiredness that had scoured away everything except the actual weight of what he was about to do. The ceremony itself took place in the great hall, transformed once more, this time for an occasion even Wilfrid's visit years earlier could not match in formality. Nobles had travelled from across the region, drawn by an event that carried real political as well as personal significance, a kingdom's heir formally stepping into the ranks of knighthood, a milestone that mattered to allies and rivals alike as a marker of the succession moving steadily forward. Aldric himself performed the central rite, Godfrey kneeling before him as his father, in a role that was in this moment more ceremonial office than parent, struck him lightly on each shoulder with the flat of a sword, the accolade, before raising him back to his feet as, formally from that moment, Sir Godfrey. Isolde watched from her place near the dais, and there is a detail here I find genuinely moving, one she mentioned, years later, to Beatrix, in a quiet, unguarded moment neither of them ever repeated to anyone else. She said that watching her son kneel before his father, in that specific instant, before the sword touched his shoulder, she saw, all at once, every version of him she had ever known. The infant Hild had once carried against her own shoulder, the 11-year-old boy stumbling over Latin verbs in a converted grain store, the exhausted, dedicated young man who had spent the previous night alone in a cold chapel, and she said the feeling of watching all of those versions collapse together into this one final moment was closer to grief than to joy, though it was, unmistakably, joy as well, the two feelings so tangled together in that instant that she never fully managed to separate them afterward, and eventually, she told Beatrix, she simply stopped trying to. The feast that followed stretched long into the evening, considerably grander even than the Christmas court we spent time with earlier, and Godfrey, newly knighted, sat that night for the first time not in the position reserved for a child of the household, but among the ranks of the castle's own knights, a small physical shift in seating that carried, everyone in that hall understood, enormous symbolic weight. Let me shift now toward Rosalind's own path forward, because her story, across these same years, moves in a genuinely different direction, shaped by considerations that fell, in this era, quite differently across sons and daughters of noble houses. By the time she is 16, discussions concerning her eventual marriage have moved from the vague, distant speculation of her younger childhood into something considerably more concrete, and I want to be honest with you about what this actually meant, because I think it deserves more nuance than a simple, flat statement of the practice. Isolde herself had been married at 17, in an arrangement negotiated entirely by her own parents, and she carries, watching these same conversations now unfold around her own daughter, a complicated mixture of feelings about it, having lived, herself, the genuine partnership that grew, unexpectedly and gradually, out of an arrangement that had begun with no particular concern for her own preference in the matter. She wants, she realizes, watching Rosalind across these months of quiet negotiation with two different allied houses, both to protect her daughter from a fate that could easily have turned out far colder than her own, and to trust that Rosalind, clever and observant in ways Isolde has watched develop since that very first morning years ago when she climbed cold-footed into her mother's bed, will find her own way toward whatever version of partnership these circumstances allow her. The match, when it finally comes, is with the second son of a moderately powerful allied house, a young man named Edmund whom Rosalind meets, formally, for the first time during a visit arranged specifically for this purpose. And I will tell you, because I think it matters, and because this story has room for a little genuine hope, that the two of them, across 3 carefully chaperoned days of conversation, discover in each other something that neither family had strictly required, but that both, privately, are relieved to see, an actual, visible warmth that suggests this particular arrangement might grow, given time, into something like what Aldric and Isolde themselves eventually built. The wedding itself, when it eventually takes place, unfolds across an entire week of celebration, hosted here at Elswick because Rosalind's own family, following the customs of the era, held responsibility for the occasion, and I want to spend some time on the specific rituals involved, because a medieval noble wedding carried layers of meaning and legal weight considerably beyond the purely romantic significance we might attach to a wedding today. The ceremony itself took place, in keeping with custom, at the church door rather than fully inside the building, the exchange of vows and the formal transfer of property and dowry conducted publicly, visibly, before witnesses whose presence served a genuine legal function, confirming later, if ever questioned, that the marriage had been properly and validly contracted. Only after these public vows had been exchanged did the party move inside for the nuptial mass itself, and Isolde, standing near the front of the small crowd gathered at the church door, found herself thinking, oddly, of her own wedding day, held in a different church entirely, under circumstances that had felt, at 17, considerably more frightening than anything she now watched her composed, clearly happy daughter experiencing. The feast that followed matched, in scale and grandeur, anything the household had produced for Godfrey's knighting, extended across several days rather than a single evening, and included on its second night a particular custom that Rosalind found simultaneously mortifying and, privately, rather sweet, the ceremonial bedding, a formal, semi-public escorting of the newly married couple to their chamber, accompanied by music, blessing, and a considerable amount of good-natured teasing from the assembled guests, a custom that served, beneath its surface merriment, the genuine legal purpose of publicly establishing that the marriage had been properly consummated, removing any later grounds for challenge or annulment. I mention this detail not to linger on it, but because it illustrates something true about medieval marriage generally, the way even its most intimate moments carried, layered beneath whatever personal feeling existed between the two people involved, a considerable weight of legal and social function that a modern audience, accustomed to thinking of marriage as a primarily private and personal matter, sometimes finds difficult to fully absorb. Rosalind and Edmund settled, following their marriage, primarily at Edmund's own family's holding, some distance from Elswick, close enough for regular visits but far enough that Isolde felt, in the months immediately following the wedding, a specific kind of quiet grief she had not fully anticipated, the particular ache of a mother's household growing permanently, irreversibly quieter. She found herself, in those first weeks, wandering into Rosalind's old chamber more often than she meant to, and standing there, in a room stripped now of most of its personal belongings, feeling the specific weight of a milestone that had been anticipated for years, and still, somehow, arrived with more force than she had braced for. Tobias, meanwhile, has grown across these same years into a young man of considerable charm, and, according to nearly everyone who deals with him regularly, rather less natural discipline than either of his older siblings displayed at the same age, a fact that causes Aldric genuine exasperation at points, and that Isolde, privately, finds herself indulging more than she probably should, aware, in the particular way a mother is often aware of her own inconsistencies, that Tobias occupies a specific place in her heart, carved out by simply being her youngest, the one who still, occasionally, even now, seeks out her company with something of the uncomplicated affection he showed as a very small boy, climbing uninvited into his father's lap. His own path forward remains, at this point in our story, somewhat less settled than his older siblings, a common enough situation for a younger royal son in this era, whose future might involve a lesser holding of his own, a role within the church, a military career, or some combination worked out gradually as circumstances and opportunity present themselves. Aldric has begun, carefully, to explore several possibilities on his behalf. Conversations conducted quietly, without the same public formality that surrounded Godfrey's clear path towards succession or Rosalind's marriage negotiations, because a younger son's future, in a household like this one, allowed for considerably more flexibility and considerably more genuine uncertainty than either of his siblings had ever really faced. Let me pause here and pull us back, gently, toward the present moment our story actually began in, that single long day we spent together at the very start, because I think there is something valuable in holding both time frames in mind together, the single ordinary Tuesday and the years that stretched out afterward, each illuminating something the other could not quite manage alone. I want to spend some time now on the formal machinery of justice within a household like this one, because it occupied a considerable portion of Aldric's actual working life across every one of these years we have moved through together, and it rarely receives the attention given to feasts, weddings, and knightings, despite being, in many respects, the single most consequential part of his daily responsibility. Aldric held what was generally understood as court, in the judicial sense, on a regular schedule, hearing disputes that ranged from the genuinely serious questions of inheritance, boundary disagreements between lesser lords, occasional accusations of theft or worse, down to matters that a modern observer might find almost comically minor, two farmers arguing over a wandering pig, a miller accused of shorting his customers on grain. All of it fell, ultimately, under his jurisdiction, and all of it demanded, in principle if not always in practice, his genuine and careful attention. Here is something worth knowing, because it complicates a fairly common assumption about medieval justice as uniformly arbitrary or cruel. Aldric's approach, and the approach of most rulers of his particular temperament and era, relied heavily on established custom and precedent, along with the testimony of witnesses and, where relevant, written record, rather than simple unchecked royal whim. He consulted regularly with a small group of advisers, men with genuine legal knowledge, before rendering judgment on anything complicated, and he understood, clearly, that a reputation for fair and consistent judgment mattered enormously to the stability of his own rule, that a lord known for capricious or unjust decisions invited exactly the kind of quiet resentment that could, given enough time and enough grievance, curdle into something considerably more dangerous. This did not mean the system was gentle by modern standards, and I do not want to suggest otherwise. Punishments for serious crimes could be severe, and the process itself offered considerably fewer protections to the accused than a modern legal system would provide. But within its own context, and by its own internal logic, it functioned as a genuine system, with real rules, real precedent, and real consequences for a ruler who violated its expectations too flagrantly, and Aldric, across every one of these years, took his role within it seriously, sometimes visibly wearied by the sheer volume of minor disputes requiring his attention, but rarely, according to those who served closest to him, careless about the actual substance of his judgments. Isolde, too, held a form of this authority, though exercised somewhat differently, primarily within the domestic sphere of the castle's own household staff, disputes among servants, questions of household discipline, matters that Aldric, by long-standing and mutually comfortable arrangement, simply deferred to her judgment on entirely, understanding that her daily proximity to that particular world gave her insight into it that he, occupied with the wider matters of the kingdom, simply could not match. Let me shift now to something that unfolds more quietly, across the years, a particular ritual of court etiquette that I have mentioned only in passing so far, and that deserves fuller attention, because it shaped nearly every interaction within these walls, in ways a modern audience might find genuinely difficult to fully internalize. Forms of address, in a household like this one, followed rules of real precision, and getting them wrong even slightly could carry social consequences well out of proportion to what might seem, to modern ears, like a minor slip. A lesser noble addressing Aldric used a specific formal title, never his given name directly, and the physical gestures accompanying any formal greeting, the depth of a bow, the specific moment at which one straightened, the precise distance maintained during any formal audience, all of it communicated rank and respect with a precision that every person raised within this world absorbed so thoroughly it became, eventually, closer to instinct than to conscious calculation. Godfrey, as a small child, had struggled visibly with this. We touched on it briefly during that very first morning of our story. His Latin lessons folding in alongside instruction in exactly these physical and verbal customs, and by the time he stood, newly knighted, receiving formal greetings from visiting nobles for the first time in his own right, rather than as his father's son, the whole elaborate choreography had become for him as natural and unconsidered as breathing, a transformation built, like so much else in this story, from years of patient, repeated practice that felt at 11 like tedious homework, and had become by 18 simply who he was. There is a journey worth telling you about now, because it reveals a side of medieval royal life that our story so far has kept mostly within these same castle walls, and the reality of ruling a kingdom of any real size rarely stayed so contained. Roughly once every year or two, sometimes more often depending on circumstance, Aldric undertook what was known as a royal progress, an extended journey across different portions of his territory, bringing a significant portion of the household along with him, moving from holding to holding, staying weeks at a time as guests of lesser lords whose obligation to house and feed the travelling court was itself a recognized and expected part of the kingdom's political fabric. This practice served several purposes at once, and I find the layered practicality of it genuinely interesting. It allowed Aldric to be seen, personally, by subjects who might otherwise never encounter their ruler in any direct way across the whole of their lives, reinforcing loyalty and legitimacy through simple physical presence in a way that no messenger or proclamation could fully replicate. It allowed him to hear disputes and assess conditions in parts of his territory considerably removed from Elswick itself, gathering information no amount of written report could fully convey. And, somewhat more practically, it distributed the very real cost of feeding and housing a large royal household across multiple hosting nobles, rather than concentrating that burden entirely on Elswick's own resources year-round, a consideration that mattered considerably more to the kingdom's actual finances than court chroniclers of the era tended to acknowledge directly. Isolde accompanied him on most of these progresses, though not always, particularly during the years when the children were very young, and the logistics involved in moving a royal household across any real distance were, frankly, staggering by modern standards. Furniture in some cases travelled with them, along with tapestries, plate, linens, and a portion of the household staff considered essential to maintaining proper standards even while technically a guest in someone else's hall. A progress of this kind could involve dozens of wagons, considerable numbers of horses, and weeks of advanced planning by hosting households eager and often genuinely anxious to demonstrate their own hospitality adequately before a visiting king and queen. Godfrey, once he reached his mid-teens, began accompanying his father on these journeys regularly, understanding them correctly as an essential part of the practical education no amount of time spent purely within Elswick's walls could ever fully provide. Across several of these progresses, to read the specific anxieties and ambitions of different hosting nobles, to notice which holdings seemed prosperous and which strained visibly under the burden of hosting the travelling court. Insight that would serve him considerably once the responsibility of ruling eventually passed fully into his own hands. Let me bring you now toward a moment that arrived considerably later in this family's story, a moment I have been saving, in a sense, because I think it belongs near the end of what we have built together tonight. Rosalind, some years into her own marriage, gave birth to her first child, a daughter, and travelled back to Elswick with Edmund's full blessing and encouragement to have her mother close during the final weeks before the birth and the lying-in period that followed. Isolde, watching her own daughter move through exactly the experience she herself had lived through as a girl of 17, found the whole experience considerably more emotional than she had anticipated. Sitting beside Rosalind through the labour itself in a role reversed now from every earlier moment of comfort and care that had passed between them, the mother now offering to her own daughter exactly what she had once offered a frightened, feverish 7-year-old on 3 long winter nights years before. The baby, when she finally arrived, healthy and loud-voiced in a way that drew genuine relieved laughter from everyone gathered in the chamber, was named at Rosalind's own insistence and to Isolde's quiet, carefully concealed delight after her grandmother. Little Isolde, as she came to be called almost immediately to avoid confusion, spent her first weeks of life in the same castle her mother had grown up in, passed between the arms of a grandmother who found herself holding this small, warm weight against her chest, thinking of nearly every version of motherhood she had lived through across the whole span of this long story. Her own mother, distant and difficult and gone now these several years, her own children, grown now into the adults standing around this very bed, and this newest small person, entirely new, entirely her own separate self, already beginning, in her own tiny way, to write a story none of them could yet fully see the shape of. The years, as years do, continue to move, and I want to spend a little time now on something quieter still, the particular texture of aging within a household like this one, because it is a part of royal life that popular imagination, so fixated on youth and coronation and conquest, tends to skip past almost entirely, and I think it deserves better than that. Aldric, by his late 50s, had begun to feel the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent largely on horseback and in armour, old injuries from tournaments and hunts announcing themselves on cold mornings in ways they had not troubled him at 30. He walked the castle's walls somewhat more slowly now, though no less regularly, Sir Baldric, himself considerably older, often walking beside him, the two of them settled into the particular easy quiet of men who have known each other across an entire adult lifetime and no longer feel any need to fill every silence between them with conversation. Godfrey, by this point, had taken on an increasing share of the kingdom's actual daily governance, hearing minor disputes himself now, sitting in on councils not as an observer absorbing lessons, but as a genuine participant whose judgment his father had come, gradually, and without any single dramatic moment marking the shift, to trust nearly as completely as his own. This gradual transfer of responsibility, unfolding across years rather than arriving in any single ceremony, represented, in its own quiet way, as significant a transition as the formal knighting had been years before, though it carried none of that earlier ceremony's public drama. Isolde, for her part, found herself, in these later years, spending considerably more time in the garden that had once belonged primarily to Rosalind's childhood curiosity, working alongside Mildred, who remained, remarkably, still active in her own advanced years, the two women moving through the same herb beds with a familiarity built now across decades rather than a single season. There is something I find genuinely lovely in picturing this, a queen and a gardener, their relative positions so vastly different by every formal measure this world recognized, settled comfortably into the kind of easy companionship that simply accumulates between two people who have spent enough years doing the same quiet work side by side. She had by this point also taken on a role she found unexpectedly meaningful, offering guidance and mentorship to Rosalind's own daughter, young Isolde, who visited Elswick regularly and had developed, much to her grandmother's quiet delight, a genuine interest in exactly the kind of household management and needlework skill that had occupied so much of Isolde's own life, passed down now not through any formal instruction, but through the same easy proximity and patient example that had shaped so much of this family's education across every generation we have followed tonight. I want to tell you about one particular evening, late in this stretch of years, because I think it draws together a great deal of what this whole story has been trying to show you. It is deep winter again, another Christmas court, though smaller now than the grand celebrations of Godfrey's boyhood, age and circumstance having gradually reduced the household's appetite for the largest and most exhausting festivities in favour of something quieter, warmer, more genuinely restful. Aldric and Isolde sit together near the great hall's hearth, much as they did that very first night we spent with them, though the fire burns a little lower now, kept modest by choice rather than necessity, and the hall around them holds a smaller gathering, Godfrey and his own wife, whom he had married some years prior in a match that had grown, like his parents' own, from careful arrangement into genuine affection. Tobias settled finally into a role managing a smaller holding not far from Elswick, visiting for the season with his own young family, and young Isolde, now nearly the same age Rosalind had been at the very start of our story, curled on a bench near the fire with a piece of needlework in her lap that her grandmother had helped her begin only days before. Aldric, the harpist, older now himself, plays something soft near the far wall, and at some point in the quiet drift of the evening, without either of them quite planning it, Aldric reaches over and takes Isolde's hand, and she lets him, and neither of them says anything about it, because after this many years, this many quiet evenings exactly like this one, there is nothing left that particularly needs saying. Let me take you back, for a while, into some of the specific sensory textures of daily life within these walls that our story, moving as it has across so many years and so many milestones, has not yet had room to properly explore. Because I think there is real comfort in this kind of close, unhurried detail, the sort of thing that asks nothing of you except to simply picture it. Consider the sound of the castle at different hours, because it changed considerably across a single day in ways that everyone who lived within these walls learnt to read almost without noticing they were doing it. The pre-dawn quiet we began our story inside, broken only by wind through arrow slits and the first efforts of the kitchen fire. The gradual swell of mid-morning activity, footsteps on stone, distant voices, the specific clatter of the kitchens reaching full operation, the dense layered noise of a formal feast, music and conversation, and the scrape of benches, and the particular percussion of dozens of people eating together in a stone room that returned every sound back on itself in an echo just slightly delayed. And then, late at night, the return to something like the morning's quiet, though warmer now, softer, banked fires ticking gently as they cooled, the occasional call of a watchman completing his rounds along the outer wall. Consider, too, the smells that marked different spaces and different hours, with a precision no modern building, with its more uniform heating and ventilation, quite manages to replicate. Beeswax and wood smoke in the family's private chambers, the heavier, more complicated smell of the kitchens, roasting meat and rendered fat, and the sharp green scent of fresh herbs, the chapel's cool stone and incense, distinct from every other space in the castle, the stables, straw and horse and leather, a smell Godfrey came to associate, across years of training there, with something close to comfort, a smell he sought out, if he is honest with himself, on days when the pressure of his eventual responsibilities weighed more heavily than usual. There is a particular texture, too, worth mentioning, to the tapestries that lined so many of the castle's walls, woven scenes depicting hunts, religious narratives, and occasionally scenes celebrating the family's own history, battles and marriages and moments of significance rendered in careful, painstaking thread by workshops whose skill rivaled anything Isolde's own considerable talent with a needle could produce, though on a scale that required teams of weavers working together across months rather than a single woman's private hours. Running a hand across one of these tapestries, as Rosalind had loved to do as a small girl, produced a specific dense, slightly rough texture, wool worked tightly enough to hold its pattern crisply while remaining underneath the formal scene depicted, genuinely functional as insulation against stone walls that would otherwise have bled heat away constantly. I want to mention too something about light itself, because it shaped this entire world in a way genuinely difficult for a modern audience, accustomed to switching a room from darkness to full illumination with a single small motion to fully absorb daylight, filtered through narrow windows, some fitted with glass by this point in this particular household's wealth and era, though glass remained expensive enough that not every window in the castle carried it, moved across stone floors and walls in slow, tracked patterns that everyone within these walls learned, without quite thinking of it as learning, to read as a kind of natural clock. Candlelight and firelight, by contrast, created a warmer, more localized pool of visibility, everything beyond its reach falling into a genuine thick darkness that made the specific, deliberate choreography of moving through a castle at night, torches and careful memorized routes, a skill every servant and family member alike had to develop early and maintain constantly. Isolde, across all these years, came to associate certain lights with certain memories in a way she found, when she noticed it, genuinely moving. The particular grey rose light of that very first dawn we spent with her standing at her narrow window listening to the castle wake. The warm gold of firelight during Christmas courts, decades of them layered now one over another in her memory until she could no longer entirely separate one year's celebration from the next. The single candle burning low beside Godfrey's bed the night before his nighting vigil glimpsed briefly as she checked on him one last time before he departed for the chapel, each one distinct and each one, somehow, also simply part of the same continuous light that had illuminated this entire long life she had built here, one ordinary and extraordinary day layered over another for longer now than she could easily count without stopping to do the actual arithmetic. There is one more feast worth telling you about before we let this story begin its slow drift toward closing, because it captures something the earlier feasts in our tale, however detailed, have not quite managed to show you: the sheer scale of preparation behind the grandest celebrations this household undertook across the years, the kind reserved for only the most significant occasions. In this case, the wedding of young Isolde, Rosalind's daughter, held here at Elswick some years after the quiet Christmas evening we just spent with the family by the hearth. Preparation for a feast of this magnitude began, in practical terms, nearly 2 months prior. Ranulph's successor as steward, a careful young man named Osgood, trained personally by Ranulph across the final years of his own long service, coordinating an effort that touched nearly every corner of the castle's operation. Additional livestock had to be secured well in advance, some driven in from outlying holdings specifically for the occasion, because a feast of this scale could not be supplied from ordinary daily stores without depleting reserves the household would need across the following months. Extra flour, extra spices, wine brought in from merchants whose relationship with this household had, by this point, spanned multiple generations of trading, each transaction building on decades of established trust. The kitchens, on the day itself, operated at a scale that dwarfed even the Christmas courts of Godfrey's childhood. Osric's own successor, a woman named Freya who had trained under him for years before eventually taking over the role, a genuinely unusual but not unheard of position for a woman to hold within a household kitchen of this size, coordinating a staff nearly triple its ordinary number. Extra hands brought in from the surrounding area specifically for the week surrounding the celebration. The dishes themselves, that night, represented some of the finest cooking this household had produced across the whole span of our story. Elaborate subtleties, decorative dishes crafted to resemble something other than their actual ingredients, a particular medieval culinary art form that delighted guests with its cleverness as much as its flavor. One memorable creation shaped and colored to resemble a small castle, complete with towers formed from spun sugar, that drew genuine delighted applause when it was carried into the hall. I want to mention, because I think it is a lovely small detail, that Aldric, well into his own later years by this point, but still, by his own insistence, unwilling to fully retire from his post, played that night alongside a younger harpist he had spent the better part of a decade training, the two of them performing together in a way that felt, to everyone who had known this household long enough to notice, like watching one generation's careful work handed forward into the next, not so different, in its own way, from everything else this family had spent our entire story handing forward, crowns and responsibilities and small private melodies alike. Isolde, watching her granddaughter dance that night with the young man she had chosen, in a match that had grown, like her own mother's before her, from careful arrangement into something that looked, watching them together, remarkably like genuine happiness, found herself thinking back, without any particular sadness attached to the thought, to that very first morning of our story, standing at her narrow window in the pre-dawn dark, listening to a castle just beginning to wake. So much had happened between that morning and this one. Entire lives had unfolded, children born and raised and married and settled into lives of their own, a husband's hair gone from dark to silver beside her own, and still, somehow, the castle itself remained, stone and hearth and hall, holding all of it, the way it had always held everything this family had ever brought into it. There is a conversation I want to tell you about now, one that took place quietly, without any of the ceremony that marked so many of this family's other milestones, between Aldric and Godfrey on an ordinary afternoon that neither of them at the time thought to mark as particularly significant, though looking back on it later, Both of them would come to understand it differently. They were walking the castle's outer wall together, a habit Aldric had maintained across decades, though his pace had slowed considerably from the brisk circuits of his younger years, and somewhere along the northern stretch, near the tower he had overseen the construction of so many years before, he stopped, resting one hand against the stone, and told his son, without any particular preamble, that he had been thinking, lately, about how much of the kingdom's actual daily governance Godfrey had already taken on, quietly, gradually, across the past several years, and that he wanted his son to know he had noticed, and that he trusted it completely. Godfrey, who had expected, if he is honest, some more formal conversation eventually, some structured discussion of succession and transition, found himself genuinely moved by the plainness of it, his father simply standing there, one hand on old stone, saying a true thing without any particular ceremony attached to it at all. He said after a moment that he still felt, some days, like the 11-year-old boy stumbling over Latin verbs, uncertain whether he could ever fully live up to what was expected of him, and Aldric, laughing slightly, told him that feeling, in his own considerable experience, never entirely went away, that he still felt it himself some mornings, decades into a reign that everyone else in this kingdom regarded as entirely secure and successful. I think this is worth sitting with, because it says something true that extends well beyond any one family or any one century. The particular vulnerability of feeling unequal to a responsibility you have nonetheless been carrying competently for years does not resolve itself simply because other people can see from outside that you are managing it. Godfrey carried that feeling for a long time yet, quietly, alongside his growing confidence, and Aldric, watching his son move through exactly the uncertainty he himself remembered from his own younger years, found in it less cause for worry than for a kind of deep, settled confidence that Godfrey was, in fact, precisely ready in the ways that actually mattered, whatever private doubt he still carried alongside that readiness. They stood together a while longer on that wall, not saying much else, watching the light shift slowly across the countryside spread out below them, fields and distant woods, and, somewhere beyond the visible horizon, all the scattered holdings and villages and lesser lords whose lives were bound up, in ways large and small, with this family's continued stewardship of the responsibility that had passed, generations back, into their keeping, and would, in time, pass forward again, the way it always eventually did. Let me tell you too, briefly, about the scriptorium's own quiet legacy, because it connects in a way I find genuinely satisfying back to where we began this whole long story. The clerks who worked there across these years maintained, alongside their more official duties, a kind of ongoing informal record of the household's daily life, brief notations tucked into the margins of otherwise formal documents, a particularly good harvest noted alongside a grain tally, a child's birth mentioned in passing within an otherwise dry account of household expenses. None of it was intended as history in any grand sense. It was simply the ordinary residue of ordinary record-keeping, and yet, taken together across the years, it forms something closer to a genuine chronicle of this family's life than any of the more formal, ceremonial documents produced for public occasions ever quite managed, small true details surviving, almost by accident, in the margins of paperwork no one particularly expected anyone to read closely. Generations later, I like to think, and this is my own small speculation rather than anything the historical record could actually confirm, that somewhere in exactly this kind of margin note, tucked into some otherwise unremarkable account of household expenses, a clerk once jotted down something about a queen who kept a private book of hours, or a princess who spent one entire summer convinced there were fish worth catching in a shallow drainage ditch, small true human details surviving quietly, unintentionally, the way most real history actually survives, not through grand proclamation but through exactly this kind of accidental, ordinary care. I want to share a handful more of these small, genuinely surprising details before we bring this story home, because I think there is a particular pleasure in this kind of accumulated curiosity, the specific facts that make a listener think, quietly, that they did not know that, and that the past held more texture, more strangeness, more ordinary human detail than the flattened version most of us absorbed somewhere along the way. Did you know, for instance, that chess, a game Aldric played regularly, most often against Sir Baldric in the quiet evening hours before either man retired for the night, carried real strategic and educational weight within noble households of this era, considered an essential part of a young noble's broader education precisely because it trained exactly the kind of patient, forward-thinking calculation that governing a kingdom actually required. Godfrey learnt the game young, taught patiently by his father across years of evening matches that Aldric, if he is honest, mostly lost once his son passed a certain age, a fact that filled him with considerably more pride than frustration, or that the household's clocks, in the sense we would recognize the word, did not exist for most of the years our story has covered. Time instead marked by the canonical hours observed by the church, a rhythm of prayer and bell that structured the entire day into segments everyone within these walls understood instinctively without ever needing to consult any mechanical device, a way of experiencing time that feels, considered now, almost meditative in its steadiness, entirely unlike the fractured, minute-by-minute awareness most of us now carry through our own days, or that mirrors within this household were small, expensive, and of considerably lower quality than anything we would recognize today, polished metal more often than true glass, meaning that Isolde, across her entire life, never once saw her own reflection with anything like the clarity most of us take for granted every single morning, a strange thought to sit with, the idea of living an entire life only ever half seeing your own face, or that the household's dogs, several of which feature throughout our story mostly in passing, held a genuinely significant place within this world, not merely as working animals for hunting, but frequently as beloved companions in their own right, Isolde herself keeping a small, elderly hound named Wisp, who slept, most nights across her final years of keeping him, curled at the foot of her bed, a detail that surprises people who assume medieval attitudes toward animals were uniformly utilitarian, when the actual record, across many households of this kind, tells a considerably warmer story, or that the household's supply of ice, gathered and packed carefully during winter months into a specially constructed underground store, allowed for a genuinely surprising range of chilled foods and drinks during the warmer months, a luxury that required considerable foresight and labor to maintain across an entire year, and that Tobias, as a small boy, had considered by his own later account one of the single greatest wonders the castle contained, better even than the falcons or the tournament grounds, a bowl of berries kept genuinely cold on a hot summer afternoon. I share these small details because I think they matter more, in the end, than any of the grander ceremony we have spent time with tonight, the knightings and weddings and formal courts. A life, any life, in any century, is made up mostly of exactly this kind of small, specific, easily overlooked texture, a favorite game, an old dog curled at the foot of a bed, cold berries on a hot afternoon, and I think a story that only ever shows you the crowns and the ceremonies has in a real sense missed most of what actually made up the days these people lived. Let me tell you about one more seasonal tradition before we ease all the way down into the close of this story, because it connects, I think, particularly well to the hour you are probably in right now listening to this. Midwinter, in this household, beyond the great feasting of the Christmas court itself, also carried a quieter tradition, observed most closely by Isolde and, in later years, by young Isolde as well. A specific evening set aside, once the larger festivities had concluded, for what the family simply called the quiet night, a single evening with no guests, no formal feast, nothing at all required of anyone, spent entirely within the smaller, warmer confines of the family's own private rooms, reading, playing chess, simply sitting together near whatever fire could be found, a deliberate pause built into a calendar otherwise crowded with obligation. Let me tell you too about the letters this family exchanged across the years, because correspondence, in an era without any faster means of communication, carried a weight and an intimacy that our own age of instant messages has, I think, gradually lost sight of, and I find something genuinely moving in picturing it. When Rosalind first left Elswick for Edmund's household following their marriage, she and Isolde began a correspondence that continued steadily across every year that followed, letters carried by trusted messengers along routes that could take anywhere from several days to several weeks depending on distance and weather, each letter representing, in a very real sense, a kind of patient investment neither woman took lightly. Isolde kept every letter her daughter ever sent her, stored carefully in the same small chest that held her book of hours, and reading back through them, in later years, she found in them a kind of chronicle of her daughter's own adult life that felt, to her, considerably more honest and unguarded than most of what passed between them during actual visits, where court etiquette and the presence of others tended to smooth over exactly the kind of small, private worry or joy that found its way more easily onto a page written alone, late at night, addressed to no one but a mother trusted completely. Godfrey, too, maintained correspondence across these years, with allied households whose relationships would matter considerably to the kingdom's stability once he inherited full responsibility for it. Letters that mixed genuine personal warmth with the careful, deliberate diplomacy that his entire education had been preparing him for since that very first morning we met him, struggling over Latin verbs in a converted grain store. He had learned by his mid-20s to write in a voice that managed both warmth and precision at once, a skill his father had modelled for him across years of watching Aldric draft his own correspondence, reading drafts aloud sometimes, asking Godfrey's opinion on a particular phrase or tone, a small ongoing education conducted almost entirely through this kind of quiet, practical example rather than any formal instruction. I want to mention, because I think it is worth knowing, that literacy itself, the actual ability to read and write, was not universal even within a household as wealthy as this one. Servants and lower household staff frequently unable to read at all, their world organized instead around oral instruction, memorized routine, and the kind of practical knowledge passed down through direct example rather than written record. Godfrey, Rosalind, and even young Tobias, despite his less disciplined approach to his formal lessons, all grew up with a level of literacy that placed them, without any of them ever quite thinking of it this way, among a genuinely narrow slice of the population of their entire era, a fact that shaped, in ways large and small, nearly everything else about how they were able to move through and eventually govern the wider world around them. Let me return one final time to the Great Hall itself, because I think it deserves one more visit before we let this whole long story finally settle down towards sleep. This single room having held, across every year we have moved through together tonight, nearly everything that mattered, feasts and quiet ordinary suppers alike, Aldric's formal justice and Godfrey's knighting, Rosalind's wedding celebration, and the granddaughter's wedding years later, the Lord of Misrule's absurd Christmas games, and countless ordinary evenings of nothing more than Edric's harp, and a low fire, and a family simply existing together in the same warm space. A room like this one, I think, absorbs something of every life lived within it, not in any mystical sense, simply in the practical sense that stone holds heat and memory holds detail, and a person standing in a space where they have spent decades of their life cannot help but feel, faintly, every other version of themselves that has ever stood there before, the 11-year-old boy and the newly knighted young man and the settled, confident ruler, all somehow present at once in the same physical room, the way Isolde had once described watching all the versions of Godfrey collapse together in the single instant of his knighting. There is one more figure in this story I want to give proper attention before we close, someone we have mentioned only briefly across all these years, and that is Beatrix, Isolde's lady-in-waiting, who first appeared in our story on that very earliest morning, laying out a deep blue gown while Isolde still lay half asleep, and who remained, across every single year that followed, one of the most constant presences in Isolde's entire life, considerably more constant, if she is honest, than almost anyone else within these walls. Beatrix had come into Isolde's service before Godfrey was even born, a young woman herself at the time, daughter of a minor household some distance from Elswick, and the relationship that grew between the two of them across the following decades occupied a strange, particular space that this era did not really have adequate language for, something considerably deeper and more genuine than the formal hierarchy of mistress and servant suggested, and yet never quite equal in the way we might now think of friendship, the difference in rank remaining real and present even as real affection grew up alongside it. It was Beatrix who Isolde had confided in, quietly, about her fear for her ailing mother on that very first morning of our story, though we did not tell you that detail at the time, and it was Beatrix, decades later, who sat with her during the quiet, unguarded moment after young Isolde's own wedding, listening as Isolde tried to put words to the tangled joy and grief of watching every version of her son collapse together in a single knighting ceremony years before. Beatrix married, eventually a household knight, and continued her service even after, raising her own children within these same walls, alongside the royal families, her own daughter growing up as something close to a playmate to young Isolde, another quiet, unremarked thread woven through this family's larger story. I mention Beatrix specifically because I think she represents something important that a story focused too narrowly on kings and queens can lose sight of entirely: the way an entire household's worth of ordinary people, servants and knights and gardeners and cooks, lived their own full lives alongside and intertwined with the more visible, more chronicled lives of the family they served, each of them carrying their own private joys and fears and small daily victories that mattered every bit as much to them as anything happening at the high table above the salt. Let me tell you finally about a particular late evening, deliberately unremarkable, chosen not for any milestone it marked, but simply because I think it captures, better than any single grand ceremony could, the actual accumulated texture of this family's life across everything we have shared together tonight. It is spring, some years after the wedding we spent time with recently, an ordinary Thursday by any measure anyone in that castle would have used to mark it. Aldric, older now, silver-haired, moves through his day with the particular unhurried rhythm of a man who has, across decades, gradually handed most of the kingdom's daily governance into his son's capable hands. Though he still walks the walls most mornings, still hears the occasional dispute Godfrey brings to him for a second opinion, still finds, in the specific texture of an ordinary working day, a satisfaction that never entirely faded across the whole span of his long reign. Isolde spends the morning in the garden with Mildred's eventual successor, a young woman trained carefully across years by the old gardener before her own hands grew too unsteady to continue the work, and the afternoon with young Isolde, now grown into a genuinely accomplished needlewoman herself, the two of them working together on a piece that will, some day, hang in the same chapel that already holds the large scriptural scene Isolde herself completed so many decades before, one generation's careful work quietly extending into the next. Godfrey spends his day much as his father once did, hearing minor disputes, reviewing accounts with Osgood, walking the wall with his own son, a boy of 10 now, who asks, with a curiosity that strikes Godfrey every time as a strange and lovely echo of his own childhood, endless questions about the tower his grandfather built, the falcons kept in the mews, the particular history of this stone or that battlement, questions Godfrey answers with a patience he suspects. Some days he inherited directly and entirely from his own father, passed down the way so much else in this family has been passed down, not through any single dramatic lesson, but through years of exactly this kind of quiet, accumulated example. That evening, the whole family gathers in the great hall for nothing more than an ordinary supper, no visitors, no particular occasion, simply the accumulated generations of this household settling together around the same tables that have held every version of this story we have told you tonight. Aldric and Isolde at the centre, as they have been for the whole of our story. Godfrey and his wife, their own children scattered along the table according to age and by this point considerably relaxed custom. Tobias, visiting for a few days from his own nearby holding, his particular easy charm undimmed by the years, still drawing laughter from whoever sits near him at any given meal. Young Isolde, when she visits, which is often, given how close Edmund's holding remains, and Rosalind herself, who has travelled back for a longer stay this particular season, her own hair beginning to show the first threads of grey, sitting close beside her mother in a configuration that echoes, without either woman needing to remark on it, the very earliest image our story ever gave you, an 8-year-old girl climbing cold-footed into her mother's bed on a chilly morning decades before. Edric's successor plays something soft near the wall, a melody young Isolde recognizes, having heard her own mother hum fragments of it across years of childhood, though she does not yet know its full history, does not know it was the same slow, half-remembered tune Isolde had once asked Edric himself to play, back in the very early years of our story, a piece of music that seemed to carry her somewhere private that no one else in the household was ever quite invited to follow. The meal itself is simple by the standards of everything we have described across the grander feasts of this story. A good stew, fresh bread, a modest amount of wine, nothing that required weeks of preparation or the labor of dozens of extra staff. And yet sitting there, watching 4 generations of her own family gathered around this single table in the same hall where her own story began, Isolde finds herself thinking, with a clarity she does not entirely trouble herself to examine too closely, that this, exactly this, ordinary and unremarkable and utterly full, is what all of it, the crowns and the ceremonies and the careful decades of governance, was always actually for. The candles are lit as the light outside finally fades completely, beeswax near the high table, the warmer honeyed smell of it filling the space the way it always has, every single evening for as long as anyone currently sitting in this hall can remember. Somewhere beyond the walls, the watchman begins his evening circuit, boots against stone worn smoother now than it was even in Aldric's own boyhood, let alone at the start of our story. The kitchens, having sent up the evening's meal, begin their own slow wind down toward the banked fire that will carry through the night and be coaxed back to life again before dawn, the same cycle repeating itself, patient and unbroken, the way it has repeated itself for as long as this castle has stood at all. Let us step outside the hall for a while now, out into the castle grounds themselves, because there is a particular quality to this place after dark that our story has visited only briefly, that first night so long ago at the very start, and I think it deserves a longer, slower look now, this deep into the telling, when your own eyes are likely growing heavy in whatever room you are actually lying in. The outer bailey, empty now of the day's ordinary bustle, holds a different kind of presence after dark, moonlight, when the sky is clear enough to allow it, falling across cobblestones worn smooth by generations of feet, catching faintly on the surface of the modest moat that Rosalind once spent an entire summer convinced held fish worth catching. The stables, quiet now except for the occasional soft shift of a horse settling deeper into sleep, straw rustling gently, the whole building holding that particular warm animal smell that never fully fades even in the coldest months. The chapel, at this hour, sits in near total darkness except for a single small lamp kept burning always near the altar, a detail this household has maintained across every year of our story. A small constant point of light in an otherwise dark building tended carefully by whichever junior priest currently holds responsibility for it, refilled with oil on a schedule so routine that no one currently serving in that role can quite remember when the tradition began, only that it has always within living memory simply continued. The garden, past the covered walkway, holds its own particular nighttime quiet, herbs and roses alike settled into whatever version of rest a plant experiences, dew beginning to gather already on leaves that will, by full morning, hold enough moisture to darken the hem of anyone who walks too close without noticing. Mildred's careful decades of tending and her successor's continuing work are invisible in the dark, present only as a shape, a suggestion of order beneath the general softness of night, waiting for daylight to reveal, once again, exactly how much careful attention this small walled space has always actually required. And high above all of it, along the northern tower Aldric built so many years before our story's later chapters, a single watchman continues his slow, familiar circuit, the same walk his predecessors have made for generations, boots finding the same worn grooves in the same ancient stone, eyes moving out across a dark, quiet countryside that holds, somewhere beyond the visible horizon, all the scattered lives this family's stewardship has touched across every year we have spent together tonight. Villages and holdings and lesser lords, all of them asleep now too, most likely, under the same wide dark sky. I think there is something worth sitting with in the way this castle, across every year and every generation we have followed through this story, has held so many different versions of the same rhythm. Dawn breaking grey and rose over the same walls, a fire coaxed back to life in the same kitchen hearth, a family gathering in the same great hall. Whatever the occasion, whatever the year, the specific faces change, slowly, generation folding into generation the way we have watched happen across this whole long telling, Aldric's silver hair, Godfrey's own children now walking these same walls their father once walked as a boy, young Isolde's needle finding the same careful, patient rhythm her grandmother once taught her. But the castle itself, and the deeper rhythm of the life lived within it, continues, patient and largely unchanged, the way a river continues even as every single drop of water within it is, at any given moment, entirely new. I want to return one final time to Isolde herself, because this story began with her, that quiet hour before dawn when she lay awake beside her sleeping husband, listening to the castle change its breathing, and I think it is fitting that we spend these last unhurried minutes with her too, though considerably later now, in the particular late season of her own long life. She still wakes most mornings before Aldric does, a habit built so deep across so many decades that she suspects at this point nothing short of genuine illness could ever fully dislodge it. She lies still for a while in exactly the way she did on that very first morning, listening, feeling the particular texture of a castle beginning to stir around her, though the sounds themselves have shifted subtly across the years. New voices among the household staff, a grandson's footsteps somewhere down the corridor that carry an echo of Godfrey's own boyhood tread, the whole building continuing its ancient morning ritual with a cast of participants that has turned over, gradually and continuously, across the entire span of years we have spent together tonight. She thinks, some mornings, of her own mother, the fear she carried so privately on that very first day of our story, the complicated grief that had followed. Eventually, when word finally came, some months later, that her mother had passed peacefully in her sleep at her own smaller holding, a loss that Isolde had mourned in her own quiet, private way, without ever quite managing to fully resolve the tangled feelings that relationship had left her carrying. She has come, across the years since, to hold that grief more gently than she once did, not resolved exactly, but settled, the way a stone settles into a riverbed, still present, still real, but no longer sharp-edged in the way it once was. She thinks too of everything this castle has held across the years of her own life within it, and finds, turning it over in her mind on this particular quiet morning, that she feels something close to genuine gratitude, not the simple, uncomplicated gratitude of a fairy tale. Her life has held real grief and real fear alongside its very real comfort and privilege, but a fuller, more honest gratitude that makes room for all of it at once. The fear and the joy, the loss and the abundance, the whole complicated texture of an actual life lived across decades within these particular stone walls. Beside her, Aldric stirs, one arm shifting across the space where she used to lie, exactly as he did on that very first morning, and she watches him for a moment in the grey, gathering light. This man she was given to at 17 without any say in the matter, who has become, across everything our story has shown you tonight, something she would have chosen for herself 100 times over if she had ever been given the choice to begin with. Outside, the sky continues its slow shift toward full morning, grey giving way to that same faint rose it always has, the same colour it held on that very first dawn we described together at the start of this long telling. And somewhere below, in the kitchens, a new day's fire is already being coaxed back to life, bread already beginning its long, patient rise, the whole ancient rhythm of this place continuing exactly as it always has, exactly as, in some form, it will likely continue long after every single person currently sleeping within these walls has become, themselves, simply another quiet thread woven into this castle's very long, very patient memory. Let me tell you about one last tradition before we begin our final descent towards sleep, because I think it belongs here, near the very end, more than it would have belonged anywhere earlier in our story. Each year, on the anniversary of Aldric's own coronation, now decades past, the household observed a quiet ceremony, considerably smaller and less elaborate than the grand feasts we spent time with earlier, held not in the great hall but in the chapel itself, a simple service of thanksgiving that Father Cuthbert had begun all those years ago, and that his own successors had continued faithfully ever since. It was never a large gathering, family mostly, along with the household's most senior and long-serving staff, Beatrix in her own later years, Ranulph before his retirement, and Osgood after him, Edric and his successor both, on the occasions their schedules allowed both harpists to attend together. The service itself was brief, a handful of prayers, a reading, a moment of quiet reflection that Aldric, across every year he observed it, used to think not of triumph or achievement, but simply of gratitude, the same complicated, honest gratitude Isolde had come to hold across her own decades within these walls. I find something genuinely lovely in the modesty of this particular tradition, especially set against everything else we have described tonight, the grand Christmas courts and elaborate weddings and formal ceremonies of state. A king who had ruled successfully for decades, whose kingdom had grown genuinely stable and prosperous under his careful stewardship, chose to mark the anniversary of his own coronation not with grandeur, but with quiet thanksgiving among the people who had actually shared the daily texture of his life across all those years. It says something, I think, about what this particular family had come to value most by the time our story reaches this late settled season, not the crown itself, but everything the crown had allowed them to build together, quietly, across decades of ordinary days layered one on top of another. The castle, across every one of these years, continued its own patient existence, largely unbothered by any of the human drama unfolding within its walls. Stone that had been quarried and shaped by hands long since gone, timber that had grown for a century in some forest before ever being felled and seasoned and raised into the great hall's massive roof beams, all of it simply continuing, the way stone and timber do, indifferent in the gentlest possible sense to the particular joys and griefs of whichever family happened to be living within it at any given moment, and yet somehow, across generations, absorbing something of all of it anyway, the way any place absorbs the accumulated weight of everything that has happened inside it. I think, if you have stayed with me this far into the night, you have probably felt your own eyes growing heavy for a while now, and that is exactly as it should be. We have travelled a long way together tonight, from a single pre-dawn hour in a castle waking slowly around a queen who could not sleep past a certain time, all the way through decades of this family's life, children born and raised and married, a kingdom governed quietly and carefully day after day after day, small private griefs held alongside genuine abundance, and now, finally, back around again to another quiet dawn, not so different from the one we started with, the same grey rose light, the same fire being coaxed back to life in the same ancient kitchen hearth. There is a particular kind of peace, I think, in stories that circle back on themselves this way, that end somewhere close to where they began, and I want to spend these last few minutes simply resting inside that circling, the way you might rest inside a familiar room after a long day away from it. Consider, one more time, the sheer density of ordinary life we have moved through together tonight. Bread rising in a kitchen built separately from the main hall for the sake of fire safety, a queen who ran the household's actual daily accounts with a precision her own steward genuinely admired, a boy struggling over Latin verbs who grew, slowly and with real effort, into a man capable of governing an entire kingdom with patience and fairness, a girl who loved a small walled garden fiercely enough to remember it, decades later, as one of the defining textures of her own childhood, a younger son whose path forward remained genuinely uncertain for years, and who found, eventually, his own quiet version of contentment in a smaller holding not far from the walls he grew up within. Consider the small, specific luxuries this family enjoyed: silk that travelled thousands of miles, spices that marked a table as connected to the wider world, jewellery that doubled, in moments of real crisis, as portable wealth, an entire household's worth of skilled labour, dyers and weavers and gem cutters and scribes, converging quietly on a single gown, a single ring, a single illuminated page. And consider, alongside all of that visible wealth, the things that mattered just as much and cost nothing at all: a mother's hand resting on a daughter's cold feet, a father's quiet pride watching his son turn a first sword over in careful hands, an old harpist playing, without being asked twice, the one particular melody that carried a queen somewhere private no one else was ever quite invited to follow. This is, I think, what history actually is, underneath all the dates and treaties and formal chronicles, an accumulation of exactly this kind of small, specific, deeply human detail, repeated across countless households, countless centuries, countless ordinary Tuesdays that felt, to the people living through them, like nothing more than another day, and that become, given enough distance and enough careful attention, something closer to a whole world. The castle continues, somewhere just past the edge of this story, into a future none of us have visited together tonight. Godfrey's own children growing, in time, into whatever versions of themselves this particular stone and this particular family's long accumulated tradition will eventually shape them into. The same patient rhythm of dawn and dusk, feast and fast, birth and marriage and quiet ordinary suppers, continuing the way it always has, the way, in some form, it likely always will, long after every name in this particular telling has faded into exactly the kind of margin note the scriptorium's clerks once left behind almost by accident, small true fragments of a life, waiting quietly to be found again by someone who thinks, reading them, that they did not know that the past held more warmth, more texture, more simple human continuity than they had ever quite imagined before tonight. Let me walk you through the turning of a single year one final time, slowly, gently, because I think the rhythm of seasons is exactly the kind of steady, repeating pattern that suits where we are now in the night, your own body settling deeper into whatever bed or chair or couch is holding you as you listen. Spring arrives at Elswick gradually, the frost easing first from the garden's outer beds where Mildred's successor begins the year's first careful planting, herbs and vegetables both, the same rotation of crops this walled space has held for generations, rosemary and sage and feverfew, alongside onions and leeks and the root vegetables that will, come autumn, be stored carefully against the coming winter. The falcons in the mews grow restless with the changing season, Cerdick's own successor, trained personally by the old falconer before his hands grew too unsteady for the delicate work, beginning the year's first flights with birds that have spent the colder months mostly resting, wings and instincts alike needing careful, patient reconditioning after winter's long quiet. Summer brings its own particular texture, longer days that stretch the household's working hours accordingly, more daylight for training in the practice yard, for tending the garden, for the kind of outdoor court business that winter's cold makes considerably less pleasant to conduct. The ice stored so carefully the previous winter, the wonder Tobias once considered greater even than the falcons, comes into its own use now, chilled drinks and preserved foods offering real relief against the season's heat, and the household's rhythm shifts to accommodate the particular demands of harvest preparation already, even this early, beginning to occupy Osgood's careful planning. Autumn, when it arrives, brings the harvest itself, and with it, a specific kind of anxious attention that touches every level of this household, regardless of rank, because a poor harvest, even for a family as wealthy and well-provisioned as this one, carried real consequences, not merely for the immediate season, but for the wider stability of the whole territory under their care. Aldric, across every year of his reign, rode out personally to assess the condition of the surrounding fields as harvest approached, a habit his own father had modelled for him, and that Godfrey, in turn, absorbed and continued once responsibility passed fully into his own hands, understanding, as his father had before him, that a ruler who paid genuine attention to the literal ground his people depended on earned a particular kind of trust no amount of formal ceremony could replicate. And then winter again, the season we have spent the most time with across this whole long story, Christmas courts and quiet nights alike, the castle drawing inward toward its own warmth, walls that felt merely cool in autumn settling into that particular bone-deep chill that shaped so much of how this household moved through its coldest months, fires built higher, activity clustering close around whatever hearth could be found, the whole rhythm of daily life folding inward the way it always has. The way, somewhere beyond this particular story, it likely still does, season following season, year following year, the same patient cycle that has carried this family and this castle across every single day we have spent together tonight. I think there is real comfort in a rhythm this steady, this repeating, this entirely unbothered by the particular urgency any single moment might seem to carry from inside it. Whatever crisis occupied Aldric's attention on any given Tuesday, whatever grief Isolde carried quietly behind an otherwise composed morning, the seasons continued turning regardless, patient and indifferent in the gentlest possible way, and there is something in that indifference, I think, that offers its own particular kind of peace, the knowledge that the larger rhythm holding your own life steady does not actually depend on your ability to manage every single thing perfectly within it. I want to spend a few final minutes on the chapel one more time, because faith, we discussed near the very beginning of our story, was woven so completely into the daily rhythm of this household that it deserves one more quiet visit before we let this whole long telling finally rest. Beyond the daily mass we described that very first morning, the chapel served, across every year of this family's life, as a space of genuine private refuge as much as formal obligation. Isolde returned there often, across decades, in moments that had nothing to do with any scheduled service, simply to sit quietly in the cool stone stillness, the single lamp near the altar burning steadily regardless of hour, a small constant point of light that she found, across every one of these private visits, genuinely settling in a way she struggled to fully articulate even to herself. Godfrey's own nighting vigil, spent alone in this same space through an entire cold night, represented only the most formal example of a pattern that shaped his whole life, returning to the chapel in moments of real uncertainty, the night before difficult negotiations, the morning of decisions that would shape the kingdom's future considerably beyond his own immediate concerns. He found, across the years, that the specific quality of silence held within those stone walls offered him something no council chamber, however wise its assembled advisers, quite managed to provide, a space simply to sit with a difficult question before he was required to answer it. Father Cuthbert, and the successors who followed him across the decades of our story, understood their role as extending well beyond the formal liturgy itself. Quiet counsel offered to household members of every rank who sought it, a listening presence that Beatrix, in her own later years, came to rely on considerably, and that even Mildred, in her own final seasons of tending the garden, found herself grateful for more than once. Small private conversations that never made their way into any formal record, but that shaped in ways impossible to fully trace the actual daily texture of how this household cared for the people living within it. I think faith, in a household like this one, functioned less as a single dramatic conviction and more as exactly this kind of steady, unremarkable infrastructure, present in the same way the kitchen's banked fire was present, tended carefully and continuously, rarely remarked upon directly, and yet quietly holding up an enormous amount of the household's actual daily well-being. The way infrastructure of any kind tends to matter most precisely when it is working well enough that no one has to think about it at all. Let me tell you finally about the very last image I want to leave you with tonight, before we let this whole long story ease all the way down into the quiet you are most likely already drifting toward. It is another pre-dawn hour, some years still further on from everything we have already described, though I will leave the exact distance vague, because I think it matters less than the steady repeating shape of the moment itself. A young woman, not yet named in our story, a granddaughter of young Isolde's own eventual children, lies awake in a small chamber not so different from the one Isolde herself woke in on that very first morning, listening to a castle change its breathing around her, wind finding every arrow slit and chimney flue, turning each one into that same low, breathy note the whole building has always made at exactly this hour, for as long as anyone in this long, layered family's memory can account for. She does not yet know all the history bound up in these particular stone walls, the nightings and weddings and quiet nighttime traditions, the small private griefs and larger, steadier joys that have accumulated here across every generation we have followed through this story. She simply lies there, the way Isolde once lay there, the way perhaps someone will lie there again long after this particular young woman's own story is folded, in turn into the castle's vast patient memory, listening to the same wind, waiting for the same grey rose light to finally reach the same narrow window, while somewhere below, in the same ancient kitchen, a fire that has never fully gone out across the whole span of this story is already, quietly, patiently, being coaxed back to life. And so, if you have made it all the way here with me tonight, I want to leave you with one last thought before we close this story properly, something that has stayed with me since I first began putting these details together, long before I ever imagined sharing them with you specifically on this particular night, in whatever room you happen to be resting in right now. We spend a great deal of our own modern lives, I think, measuring significance by scale, by spectacle, by the kind of grand, documented moment that makes it into a history book or a headline. And there is real value in stories like Godfrey's knighting, like the great Christmas courts, like the elaborate weddings that drew nobles from considerable distances to witness them. But I find myself, the more time I spend with households like this one, increasingly convinced that the actual substance of a life, any life, royal or otherwise, lives mostly in the smaller, quieter register we have spent so much of tonight exploring together. A queen's hand on her daughter's cold feet, a father's pride watching a son turn a first sword over in careful hands, an old harpist teaching a younger one the exact melody a queen once asked for, over and over, across years, without either of them ever quite naming what it meant to her. These small moments do not announce themselves as significant while they are happening. They simply happen, ordinary and unremarked, and it is only later, looking back across an accumulated span of years, the way we have looked back across this whole story tonight, that their real weight becomes visible, layered one on top of another, until they form something that looks, from enough distance, remarkably like an entire life well and fully lived. I think that is probably true of your own life too, whoever you are, wherever you are resting right now, listening to my voice in the dark. The moments that will matter most, looking back, are probably not the loud, documented ones, though those have their place too. They are probably closer to this, ordinary, unremarked, easily overlooked in the moment they are actually happening, and entirely, quietly, essential all the same. The castle, in our story, continues on past the edge of everything we have shared together tonight, into a future none of us will ever fully see. Generations folding into generations the way we have watched happen across every year of this telling, the same patient stone holding up the same patient rhythm of dawn and dusk, feast and fast, birth and marriage and quiet ordinary suppers, long after every single name we have spoken tonight has faded into whatever margin note or fragment of memory eventually survives it, if anything at all survives it, which is, itself perhaps, not really the point. The point, I think, if there is one, is simply this. A life gets to be ordinary and extraordinary at exactly the same time, the way this whole family's life has been, across every single day we have spent together tonight, and there is nothing in that ordinariness that diminishes the extraordinary weight of it, and nothing in the extraordinary weight of it that erases the plain, simple, ordinary comfort of a fire being coaxed back to life in the same kitchen hearth, morning after morning, for as long as anyone can remember. Before that, though, let me tell you about the household's cat, because every castle of this kind kept several, and this particular one deserves a small mention of her own. Her name, according to Rosalind, who had named her at age 6 and refused all suggestions of anything more dignified, was simply Butter on account of her pale cream-coloured fur, and she held, across nearly 15 years of surprisingly long life for a working castle cat, an unofficial but widely acknowledged position as chief guardian of the grain stores against the mice that would otherwise have found their way into every careful reserve the household depended on. Butter was, by all accounts, a genuinely poor conversationalist and an entirely indifferent companion to anyone who wanted affection on their own schedule rather than hers, and yet she had, across the years, attached herself with real and visible preference to Isolde specifically, appearing without fail in the solarmost afternoons to settle, uninvited, directly on top of whatever needlework Isolde happened to be working on at the time. A small daily inconvenience that Isolde, if she is honest, had come to genuinely look forward to, the warm, solid weight of an animal who wanted, for reasons known only to herself, exactly this particular lap, and no other. There is one more small custom worth mentioning before we return to that quiet autumn afternoon, something we have not yet had occasion to describe, concerning the particular care this household gave to its own oldest and longest-serving members as they moved into the later years of their service. Mildred, in her final seasons of tending the garden before her hands grew too unsteady for the finer work, was never simply set aside once her formal duties ended. She remained within the castle, given a small comfortable chamber of her own near the kitchens, consulted regularly by her own successor on questions of soil and season that decades of accumulated experience had taught her better than any written record could have preserved, and visited often in her final years by Isolde herself, the two women sitting together in exactly the easy, comfortable silence that had grown between them across their many shared seasons in that same walled garden. This was not universal practice across every medieval household of this era, I want to be honest with you about that. Circumstances varied considerably, and not every servant who gave decades of loyal service could count on this kind of continued care once age or illness limited their usefulness in any strictly practical sense. But within this particular household, shaped by Isolde's own careful, attentive management across her entire adult life, a genuine culture of loyalty flowing in both directions had taken root. Servants who had given this family decades of quiet, faithful labor finding, in turn, that the family remembered and honored that labor, even after the labor itself was no longer being actively performed. Ranulph, too, in his own retirement, remained a welcome and regular presence within the castle, consulted informally by Osgood on matters of household finance that his own decades of careful record-keeping had given him an understanding of that no amount of formal training alone could fully replicate, and Aldric, even after age finally forced him to set his harp aside for good, continued to be invited to every significant feast and quiet family evening alike, seated near the fire, listening to his own successor play melodies he himself had taught him, note by careful note, across years of patient instruction. I find something genuinely moving in this particular thread of the story, the way loyalty and care within this household moved consistently in both directions across every level of its hierarchy, not merely from servant to master, but from master to servant as well. A small, quiet counterweight to everything else we have discussed tonight about rank and precedent and the careful, rigid choreography of medieval social order. Underneath all of that formal structure, something warmer and more genuinely reciprocal had grown, slowly, across decades, the way most real loyalty actually grows, not through grand gesture, but through exactly this kind of accumulated, ordinary faithfulness, tended quietly, year after year, the way Mildred once tended her herb beds, the way Edric once tended a melody a young queen had asked him, so many years before, to play for her again. Let me tell you about one more ordinary evening, distinct from all the others we have visited, because I think it holds a small, quiet detail worth ending on before we move into these very last images together. It is autumn again, some years past the granddaughter's wedding we spent time with earlier, and Isolde, well into the settled later stretch of her own long life, finds herself alone for once in the solar, the needlework in her lap set aside for the moment, simply watching the light move slowly across the floor as the afternoon draws toward evening. Aldric is out walking the walls with Godfrey, a habit the two of them have maintained across years now, and the rest of the household moves through its own ordinary business somewhere beyond this particular quiet room. She thinks, in this unhurried hour, of the very first morning we described together, herself standing at that narrow window in the dark, listening to the castle wake, carrying a fear about her mother she had told no one. She thinks of how much has happened since, and how little, in some essential way, the actual shape of her days has changed, still waking early, still finding comfort in this same castle's particular rhythm, still, even now, discovering small private griefs and joys that she mostly keeps to herself, tucked away the way she once tucked away that first morning's fear, not because she cannot share them, but because some things simply want to be held quietly, close to the chest, for a while before, if ever, they are spoken aloud. Beatrix finds her there eventually, settling into the seat across from her, with the easy familiarity of decades, and the two women sit together for a while, without much conversation at all, the particular comfortable silence that only accumulates between people who have known each other long enough to no longer need to fill every quiet moment with words. Eventually Beatrix asks, gently, what she is thinking about, and Isolde, after a long pause, tells her, simply, that she was thinking about how strange and lovely it is that an entire life can hold this much, this many mornings and evenings, this many small private fears and larger, steadier joys, and still, somehow, feel like it passed in hardly any time at all. Beatrix, who has heard versions of this exact reflection from Isolde more than once across their many years together, simply nods and reaches over and takes her hand, the way Aldric sometimes does by the fire in the great hall, a small, wordless gesture that says everything either of them actually needs said in that particular quiet hour. Outside, the light continues its slow autumn slide toward evening, the same light that has fallen across this castle's stone for longer than anyone currently living within its walls can properly account for, and somewhere below, in the kitchen, preparations for the evening meal are already quietly underway, the same patient rhythm continuing exactly as it always has, exactly as it will, in some form, continue long after this particular quiet autumn afternoon has folded itself into everything else this castle has ever held. I want to leave you with a handful of very last details before we truly close this story. Small things that did not fit neatly anywhere earlier, but that I did not want to lose entirely, because I think they add a little more texture to the picture you have been building in your mind across this whole long night. There was a particular window seat built into the thickness of the wall in the solar where Isolde once did her needlework, deep enough that Rosalind, as a small girl, used to curl into it entirely, knees drawn up, and later young Isolde did exactly the same thing, decades on, in the same worn stone hollow. Neither of them ever told directly that this was a family habit, simply discovering, independently, the same comfortable curve of old stone that fit a small curled body almost perfectly. There was a particular dog beyond Wisp, whom we mentioned briefly, a much earlier hound belonging to Aldric's own father, whose name has not survived clearly in any record, but who was, according to a story passed down informally through generations of household staff, so devoted to the old king that he refused to eat for 3 full days after his master's death, a detail that may have grown slightly in the telling across the years, the way these things often do, but that everyone within the household continued to repeat anyway because it felt true to something real about the old king's character, even if the precise facts had softened at the edges with time. There was a particular bell, the same one that called the household to morning mass on that very first day of our story, cast generations before Aldric's own birth, cracked once during a particularly hard winter, and carefully repaired rather than replaced, so that it rang, ever after, with a faint, distinctive imperfection in its tone that everyone who lived within these walls long enough came to recognize instantly, a small flaw that had become, over time, simply part of the sound itself, inseparable from what the bell was supposed to sound like at all. There was a particular recipe, a spiced pear dish Osric had perfected across years of quiet experimentation, that Freya learnt from him before he finally retired, and that she taught in turn to her own successor, a dish that appeared, in one form or another, at nearly every significant feast across this entire story, without any of us ever pausing to name it directly, simply present, quietly, at the edge of scenes we were paying attention to for other reasons. And there was, finally, a particular patch of wall along the northern tower, worn slightly smoother than the stone surrounding it, where generations of hands, Aldric's own included, had rested for a moment during a slow circuit of the walls, thinking through some difficult problem or simply pausing to watch the light change over the countryside below, an entirely unremarkable stretch of stone that had nonetheless absorbed a genuinely significant portion of this family's private, unrecorded thinking across the whole span of years we have spent together tonight. Before we let the story rest completely, I want to give you one more quiet room to stand in, because I think there is comfort left in it yet, and the night still has a little more patience in it than you might expect. Let us go back, one final time, to the great hall itself, empty now, this particular late hour, of everyone except the last dying light of a fire that has been fed carefully, deliberately, to burn low and slow rather than bright, the way a household learns to bank a fire when it wants warmth to last through hours no one is actively tending it. The trestle tables have long since been cleared and stacked against the far wall, the way they are every single night, freeing the floor for whatever the following morning might require of it. A habit so old within this household that no one currently serving here could tell you when it began, only that it has always, within their own memory, simply been done this way. The tapestries along the walls catch the last faint movement of firelight, hunting scenes and old family histories rendered in careful thread, shifting almost imperceptibly as the flames beneath them settle further into their coals. If you stood there now, in that particular hush, you would hear very little. The faint tick of cooling stone, the occasional soft settle of ash falling from a log that has finally burnt down past holding its shape, somewhere, very distantly, beyond thick walls, perhaps the watchman's footsteps, perhaps only the wind finding its way through the same arrow slits it has always found, turning them into that same low, breathy note the whole building makes at exactly this hour, every single night, the sound we began this story with so long ago, and the same sound, I think, this castle will go on making long after every person we have followed through this story has become nothing more than a name in a margin note, if that. I want you to imagine for just a moment longer that you yourself have been given a room here tonight, a small chamber not so different from any of the ones we have visited together, a narrow window, a coverlet stuffed with wool, a hearth banked low but not quite out. Imagine settling into it now, the way Isolde once settled, the way Rosalind once settled as a small girl with cold feet, the way every single person in this long layered story has settled, night after night, across every year we have spent together tonight. There is nothing required of you in this room except rest, no lessons to master, no disputes to hear, no gowns to be laid out for a morning that has not yet arrived. Simply this, a warm bed, a low fire, a castle holding its breath quietly around you, patient, steady, entirely unbothered by the hour, waiting, the way it always waits, for morning to arrive in its own good time. Let your breathing slow now, if it has not already begun to on its own. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, that small unconscious tension most of us carry there without ever quite noticing until we deliberately let it go. There is nothing left for you to do tonight except exactly what you are already doing, lying still, letting these words move past you the way the wind once moved past every arrow slit and chimney flue in a castle that existed in the particular way we built it together tonight, only for the length of this one telling, and yet felt, I hope, real enough while you were inside it. Picture, one final time, that narrow window Isolde stood before on the very first morning of our story, the sky beyond it shifting slowly from grey toward that faint gathering rose. Picture the kitchen far below, a fire that never fully goes out, being coaxed back to life by hands that have done this exact task every single morning for longer than anyone currently living within those walls can properly remember. Picture the whole vast, quiet structure around it, stone that has absorbed decades of exactly this same rhythm, dawn following dusk following dawn, patient and steady and entirely unbothered by whatever particular urgency any single day, viewed from inside it, might have seemed to carry. You do not need to hold on to any of the details anymore. The names, the years, the specific texture of a particular gown or a particular melody, none of it needs to stay with you past this point. What I hope stays, instead, is simply the feeling underneath all of it, the sense of a life, many lives, folded one over another across generations, ordinary and extraordinary at once, held steady by something larger and more patient than any single person's individual worry or joy. Let that steadiness hold you too, for the rest of tonight. Whatever you carried into this room with you, whatever small worry followed you here the way Isolde's own quiet fear once followed her through an entire long morning, let it settle now, the way her fear eventually settled, not resolved exactly, but softened, held gently within a larger, steadier rhythm that does not require you to solve anything else before you are allowed to rest. The fire in that ancient kitchen is banked low now, coals glowing faintly beneath their careful covering of ash, waiting patiently for morning. The watchman has nearly completed his final circuit of the night, somewhere in a chamber not so different from any of the ones we have visited together tonight. Someone very much like you, in a life very much your own, is exactly where you are right now, drifting, slowly, gently, towards sleep, carried there by nothing more dramatic than the simple, steady accumulation of an ordinary day finally, fully, coming to its rest. There is nothing more the story needs from you now, truly nothing, no name to hold on to, no detail you are required to carry forward, nothing left to follow or remember, only this last long, slow settling, breath by breath, into whatever rest is waiting for you tonight, the same rest that has been waiting, patiently, at the end of every single day this castle has ever held, for every single person who has ever lain down within its walls, or within the walls of any place that ever felt, even briefly, like somewhere safe enough to finally close your eyes. Whatever room you are actually in tonight, wherever in the world it happens to sit, whatever city or town or quiet corner of a house you are currently resting inside, I hope it has felt, for these last little while, a little like that castle did, warm enough, quiet enough, safe enough to simply stop holding on to anything at all. Let the last of the candlelight fade behind your own closed eyes now, slowly, unhurried, the way it fades every single night behind the last shuttered window in that quiet castle we built together across these many hours, stone and hearth and hall settling, finally, fully, into the deep, unhurried dark that carries everyone within it, king and queen and kitchen boy alike, gently through until morning. Sleep well, truly, all the way through until whatever hour the morning finally decides to arrive for you. I will be here again next time, whenever you need somewhere quiet to land.